Good morning. My name is Alan Weil. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Health Affairs. We're very pleased today to have an event to announce the release of our February issue on biomedical innovation. It's a tremendous collection of articles, as they are every month. And as I said in my editor's letter at the front of the issue, biomedical innovation represents the best and enables the worst of our healthcare system. We have tremendous advances in quality of life, in longevity, in care and quality of care associated with innovation, as we have published in our own pages and others have analyzed as well. Innovation has also been the primary driver of the increase in cost in the healthcare system and is sometimes overwhelming to patients as they get drawn into a system that sometimes seems more oriented towards technology than it is to patient engagement and patient care. It's the balance of those two that we always seek to achieve, and it's the tension between the opportunities and the challenges in the healthcare system brought about by innovation that animate the papers in this issue. We will run through a number of panels today touching on different angles on the topic. This is not the Sovaldi issue, but it is hard to miss that these papers were in creation and editing as the nation came to understand exactly the trade-offs associated with an incredible advance from a biomedical perspective, an opportunity to cure and really cure a disease that has tremendous burden in the U.S. And elsewhere around the world, and yet the cost associated with it placing a burden on payers in the short run for the potential savings in the long run. So these issues that we're addressing in this February issue of Health Affairs predate that event and will continue with us for a long time. But it's in that context, I think, it's appropriate to note that the topics of discussion in this issue are of ongoing policy relevance. As I start today, I do want to acknowledge Jamie Robinson and Dana Goldman, who were advisors for this special issue, helping us frame the topics and putting the theme together and reviewing the papers to make sure they had coherence. I want to thank those sponsors who made it possible. They're up on your screen. They are the Biotech Industry Organization, BIO, the National Pharmaceutical Council, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, PhRMA, AdvaMed, the Advanced Medical Technology Association, and Pfizer. And also, as we release this issue, I do want to note for those of you here that we have also relaunched Data Watch, which is a product we had in the journal for some time. About 5 years ago, it stopped running, but it is shorter pieces with closer looks, focusing on data, fewer words, more charts and graphs, and more data. We relaunched it in February with support from the Physicians Foundation. This will be an ongoing feature going forward. We will also be relaunching our blog. I'll say more about that next month, but it's in the works for us to do some restructuring on the blog. So with the thanks to the supporters of the issue, the advisors for the theme, let me move into the content that I know you're here to hear about. Our first panel is big, and so you'll get a lot of information put out to you, and then we'll have hopefully a little bit of time for Q&A. You'll hear from Ernie Berndt, Louis Seeley, professor of applied economics at MIT Sloan School of Management and co-director of the Biomedical Enterprise Program, which is a joint program between MIT Sloan and Harvard MIT Division of Health Sciences Technology. You'll hear from John Powers, a physician investigator, assistant clinical professor of medicine at George Washington University School of Medicine. He has been the lead medical officer for antimicrobial drug development and resistant initiatives within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the US FDA. You'll hear from Lauren Baker, Chief of Health Services Research at Stanford University, Professor of Health Research and Policy, and Center for Health Policy Primary Care Outcomes Research Fellow. And you'll hear from Greg Daniel, a fellow in economic studies and managing director for evidence development and innovation in the Engelberg Center for Healthcare Reform at the Brookings Institution, and finally Ron Evans, adjunct clinical professor at the University of the Pacific School of Pharmacy, adjunct research professor and consultant at Tufts University Center for the Study of Drug Development, and visiting lecturer at Northwestern University School of Medicine. So without further ado, I'll hand this over to Ernie.
Thank you. I'll be talking about some joint research with three folks from the IMS Institute for Healthcare Informatics. The access to the IMS data, as well as analytical research undertaken by the folks at the IMS Institute, was funded in part by pharma. Over the years, critics of the pharmaceutical industry have focused often on the very high prices and the very substantial revenues garnered by big pharma. Supporters of big pharma have in turn said, look, the costs of developing a drug are very high, the process is very risky. Very few studies have tried to put both sides together into one and taken a look at both simultaneously revenues and costs. That's our focus here. There have been a few of these studies in the past. There was a 1992 study by OTA, a 1998 study by CBO, and a 2002 study by Grabowski and Vernon that looked at new drugs launched in the 1980s and early 1990s. That's about 30 years ago, so we thought it was time for a new study. All three of those studies concluded that if you take into account the opportunity costs of capital, that is to say, what returns could have been earned had the funds been invested elsewhere, that the economic profits were slightly positive. That is to say, the returns that were garnered by biopharmaceutical companies on their new drug launches were slightly greater than the opportunity cost of capital. As I said, much has happened since then. We've got Hatch-Waxman, we've got biologics, we have much generic penetration, we have globalization. Those previous studies were all US studies. And so we thought it was time to update and expand. So we looked at 466 new drugs launched in the US and globally since 1991, between 1991 and 2009. These were about 80% small molecules, 20% biologics. And we looked at their lifetime sales. We defined lifetime for a small molecule as loss of exclusivity plus 24 months, and for a biologic as loss of exclusivity plus 60 months. We calculated present value of lifetime sales using discount rate of 11% for small molecules, 11.5% for biologics, and we deducted average operating costs and average R&D costs using publicly available data. And finally, to obtain our measure of economic profits, we subtracted lifetime present values of costs, including after-tax R&D, from lifetime present values of sales to get a measure of economic profits. And again, I'm an economist, so when I talk about economic profits being close to zero, that means accounting profits can still be quite positive. We're talking about profits that are earned over and above the opportunity cost of capital. We did these calculations annually between 1991 and 2009, and then we put them into multi-year cohorts, 1991, 94, 95, 99, 2000, 2004, 2005, 2009. What are our results? First striking finding, at least to us, is how very volatile our revenues. There's been a lot of discussion publicly about how risky our costs of development, but actually if you look at the relative volatility of costs of development through the phases, that's much less volatile than our revenues. The red bars here are lifetime present values for small molecules. The olive bars are for biologics, and the blue bars are for overall drugs. As you can see, looking at the blue bars, between between 1991-94, the average present values was around 3.4 billion of lifetime sales. That increased substantially 95-99 to 4.6. Continued growing 2000, 2004, but notably a very sharp decline for lifetime present values of sales for drugs launched since 2005. The other point to notice here is just how very fabulously successful were biologics, particularly during the golden era between 1995 and 2004, those very tall olive bars. One way also to look at the volatility of sales is to ask what proportion of new drugs launched reached certain thresholds. If you look at this red bar at the top, or the red line, you'll see that on the vertical axis there's lifetime sales of 5 billion and of 10 billion, where those two horizontal lines are. What you see here is that for the 2000-2004 cohort, about 72% of drugs had lifetime sales of less than $5 billion. By the 2005-2009 cohort, this was up to 82%. Alternatively speaking, what that says is we had many more blockbusters as a proportion of new drug launches in earlier cohorts, but they're a very small number in the most recent cohort. 1 minute, okay? Let's compare revenues to costs. The bar to the left for each of these cohorts is a revenue bar. The sum of the four bars to the right are the costs. You can see for the first three cohorts, the blue bar is slightly taller than the bar to the right of it. That suggests that economic profits were positive, but you see that changing very dramatically in the most recent cohort. Final slide here. If you look at economic profits, therefore, what you see is they were positive, particularly for biologics during the golden era, 1995 through 1999. They declined somewhat in the 2000-2004 era, but by the 2005-2009 era, the present value of costs were greater, slightly greater than the present value of revenues, leading to negative profits. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm John Powers. I'm an associate clinical professor of medicine at GW here in DC, and I'm presenting this, our article, Repairing the Broken Market for Antibiotic Innovation, for my co-authors Kevin Outerson, Greg Daniels, also on the panel, sitting right here. So ask him all the questions when we're done, and Mark McClellan. So first I want to outline the problem. The problem is that as we continue to use antibiotics over time, some of them can decrease in effectiveness. And so what that means is antibiotic resistance is more than a phenomenon in a test tube. It means it affects patient outcomes. In serious and life-threatening diseases, that means death or disability for patients. And resistance is caused in a large part by inappropriate use both in human disease and in animals. And in fact, the CDC still estimates that about 50% of antibiotics that are used are either given to people who don't need an antibiotic at all, or they get the wrong antibiotic. The other issue here is that there have been a number of scientific issues with discovery of antibiotics. You know who discovered antibiotics? The bacteria themselves. And we then harness them and use them to treat disease. But developing new antibiotics has actually been very particularly hard. There's very scientific challenges, and in fact, up until the last couple of years, there were no new types of antibiotics discovered since the 1960s. So there are also important economic issues regarding antibiotics. The first is most old antibiotics still work. Therefore, there's competition from older antibiotics. Because those old antibiotics still work, there's limited uptake of newer drugs that come onto the market, in part because, one, the older drugs still work, but also because many of the new drugs that are developed do not have added advantages over the old drugs. They look remarkably similar. The third thing is that there's been relatively low government investment in developing therapeutics in this area, and in fact, famously in the 1970s, one government official said that we had conquered infectious diseases, when in fact that certainly isn't true. And then lastly, there's development issues. I already mentioned the lack of added benefit of many of the antibiotics that have been developed over the last 30 years. And in fact, a study we published last year showed that approximately half of antibiotics that have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration since 1980 have been withdrawn from the market, in comparison to about 10% of other therapeutic areas. And this is either because of problems with the safety or efficacy of those drugs, but 2/3 of which were because they didn't sell. They didn't have added benefits, so people didn't use them. So what are the current incentives that have been proposed? The first is clinical trial simplification. Well, the first is the Tufts Center for Drug Development actually shows that antibiotics already have the shortest and smallest trials, and an Eastern Research Group study shows it won't help. If you make the trials even smaller than they already are, it still won't increase the net present value for companies. The second thing is there's public-private partnerships, such as the Biodefense Agency for Research and Development, or BARDA, but the question is there sufficient funding in those areas? The recently passed Get Antibiotic Incentives Now, or GAIN Act, passed in 2012, gave 5 years of additional marketing exclusivity to virtually any new antibiotic that comes onto the market, but that delays the value of money for companies and really doesn't make those drugs more valuable now. And lastly, that GAIN Act had a complete lack of prioritization of what interventions would be better for people. And this sort of falls into the been here, done that. Our study showed that those kinds of antibiotics quickly fall off the market because they don't have added benefits. And lastly, the GAIN Act focuses completely on bugs and pathogens. And I would point out this article that came out in December's Nature, which actually said we should completely ditch this term pathogen, and that this focus solely on bugs instead of patients has actually hindered getting new treatments. And the issue is the reason why some of the antibiotic resistance has occurred that we have today is because the patients are vastly different. We didn't have bone marrow transplants or the kinds of cancer chemotherapy when penicillin was discovered in the 1940s that we have today. And there is clear differences in the effectiveness of drugs, even with penicillin in the 1940s, depending upon who the patients were. In other words, penicillin's effect was different in older, sicker people than it was in younger people. So what are some real solutions to this problem that we propose in our paper? The first is increased incentives for development, surveillance, and stewardship. And that is that the development costs have to be increased on the front end to actually develop truly novel therapeutics. And by that, we don't mean just the next cephalosporin antibiotic. We mean looking beyond that into biologics, biofilm inhibitors, bacteriophages, host immune therapeutics. And in fact, like I mentioned, a lot of people die from infections because their immune system cannot respond. It's not related to the bug. It's less superbugs than vulnerable patients. Also, surveillance. Can we monitor better what's actually going on out in the community? And finally, we have to stop the issue that 50% of antibiotics are not being used to help people. And that's a stewardship issue. The second is targeting incentives towards higher priority needs. In other words, every single antibiotic that comes along should not be getting these incentives. It should be targeted to the ones that actually have added benefits and improved patient outcomes. And then lastly, enhanced global collaboration. One of the things that's very clear is that the sales volume model for antibiotics doesn't work. There's a clear incentive for companies once they develop a new antibiotic to try to sell the heck out of it to the most people they possibly can. That's the way business works. What that actually does, though, is it actually promotes inappropriate usage. And as I said, since most cheaper antibiotics still work for most patients, it puts people in a bind. And if you limit the usage of the drug to the patients who really need it, that will not be adequate reimbursement for the companies. So therefore, there's been a lot of discussion about delinking sales and usage, and to do that on a more global scale. And that is that, in other words, perhaps people would pay like an insurance policy that the company would get reimbursed to use the drug for developing the drug, even if people don't use it on the back end. So I'll stop right there and pass it on to the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here and be able to share our work with you this morning. The work that I'm going to talk about is joint work with, hey, where did all my colleagues go? Suzanne Pershing and Kate Bundorf, two colleagues of mine, at Stanford and Suzanne from the VA, and then some more VA colleagues, Todd Wagner, Christine Shi, Steve Ash, and I hope I just didn't leave someone out. Great bunch of folks to work with. We've been looking here at a tale of two drugs in two systems. So the two drugs are two biologics for the treatment of age-related macular degeneration. This is a progressive, degenerative condition in the elderly, the leading cause of age-related blindness in the elderly. And before about 2005, there wasn't much you could do to treat it. But in 2005, folks started to discover that Avastin, a drug then on the market for cancer, marketed for cancer, was effective at treating age-related macular degeneration and began to use it off-label for this purpose. It's fairly inexpensive, at least in comparison today. It costs about $50 per injection to the Medicare program, where it's a Part B covered drug. And we're also going to look at the VA, where it costs something like $450, up to $450 per injection, although there's a certain amount of variability if you dig into the VA data. Soon after Avastin was noted to be useful for age-related macular degeneration, Genentech, the maker, decided that it would produce a very similar but technically different drug and market it specifically for age-related macular degeneration. They called this Lucentis, and that was put on the market in 2006 at a considerably higher price. Medicare pays about $2,000 a dose for Lucentis, and the VA pays up to $1,450 a dose for Lucentis. So a 2,000 to 50 ratio in the Medicare program and about a 3x ratio in the VA program. These two are noted clinically in trials and other data and other evidence to have very similar efficacy. They work about the same. There is some evidence that has been around that suggests that maybe Avastin has slightly higher risks, but to make a long story short, my clinical colleagues tell me that evidence is not particularly strong or is related to some specific compounding situations that seem to have been resolved. So not any particularly strong worry about either of them, and both seem to have similar efficacy. So we look at these two drugs in two systems, Medicare and the VA, where there are very different incentives for their use. In Medicare patients, physicians these are Part B injectable drugs, and so physicians are reimbursed for the drug plus a 6% markup, which is considerably higher on a $2,000 dose than it is on a $50 dose. And so physicians have a very strong financial incentive to use Lucentis rather than Avastin. But the patients, if there are financial incentives, would go the other way. To the extent that patients in the Medicare program face cost sharing, they would pay higher cost sharing for Lucentis rather than Avastin. So the physicians have a strong incentive. Patient incentives are a little bit muted because many patients have supplemental coverage or other sources of coverage that would reduce the effect of those financial incentives for patients. In the VA, there really is no financial incentive. Physicians are salaried. They don't have an incentive either way. Patients face no cost sharing either way, and so there's no difference in the financial incentives there. There has been some availability difference in the VA of Lucentis became available nationwide right away, 2006, but it took them a little while to put Avastin, the less expensive drug, on the national formulary. So it was idiosyncratically available in different parts of the country at different times before 2009, but not nationwide until 2009. So there you go. There's the study. Look at the two drugs. Look at the two systems. I might characterize myself as sort of simplistically having thought that we would see differences based on financial incentives, and the economist in me thinking that the financial incentive for physicians would lead Lucentis to diffuse rapidly in the Medicare program, but without incentives in the VA, perhaps the value consciousness would dominate and we'd see Avastin diffuse more rapidly in the VA system. Now that's a little bit oversimplistic, and in fact, we found neither of those to be true. So what's our study in a slight nutshell? Administrative data from the VA and from Medicare from 2005 to 2011. We pick people over age 65. We pick folks who were covered and alive for entire calendar years, and we look at their utilization. We track the total number of injections in each system. We track the number of injections per user per year, and we look at those trends over time. And I'm just going to show you some very basic graphs, but that's pretty much the study, see what happened, and see if we can make any inferences about the financial incentives from those comparisons. So here's graph one. 4 lines. Purple line on the top, total number of injections in a 20% sample of Medicare patients per year, starting in 2005, ending in 2011. We start at about 25,000 injections of these drugs in this 20% sample. We end at just under 350,000 of these drugs in this injections of these drugs in this 20% sample. Those are split into bevacizumab, which is Avastin, I should have called it Avastin on here, and ranibizumab, which is Lucentis. And in fact, if we had thought that Lucentis would diffuse faster, it actually diffused a little bit slower. The orange line is higher Avastin than the blue line, suggesting that Avastin actually diffused somewhat more rapidly in the Medicare population. I'll just quickly note that if you're doing very rapid mental math, you will detect the size of the financial impact on the Medicare program, where people have noted that if you were to switch everyone from Lucentis to Avastin in 2011, in that year alone, you would have saved $1 billion for the Medicare program. The size of the dollars here is actually quite large. Didn't go the way we thought it was going to go. In the VA, here's the data on the VA. Much lower utilization totals in the aggregate, but similar diffusion for the blue and the orange line in the middle. The two drugs diffuse at about the same rate, and in fact, you can't distinguish any statistically significant difference. Running out of time, I will quickly say that here's a slide that says the number of injections per year per user is fairly similar in all of the settings, 3 to 5 injections per year in Medicare or the VA, depending on which drug you use, a little bit different, but not a lot of action in that dimension. So what do we conclude? Slower diffusion of Lucentis in Medicare is inconsistent with a view that physician financial incentives would dominate and drive faster diffusion of Lucentis, although the continued use of any Lucentis suggests that there may be some physician incentive for some physicians to continue to use the much more expensive drug. The slower diffusion of Avastin does suggest, or the faster diffusion of Avastin does suggest some role perhaps for patient financial incentives and for value consciousness. The similar diffusion rates in the VA are also a little harder to interpret, but they do not suggest that there was an overriding value consciousness in the VA that dominated, or that took hold in the absence of a financial incentive. And in fact, we would look much more, as we parse the data more carefully, at cultural and site-specific policies at different parts of the VA, because there's a lot of variation from place to place that seems to dominate and drive these trends more so than any particular incentive. So I had a couple more things to say, but I will just note that this is still financially very important, and we're going to continue to work on it, and stop with that.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Greg Daniel from the Brookings Institution. Before I get kicked off, I'd like to thank Health Affairs staff and sponsors for creating this theme issue. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out to discuss a lot of these important issues that are critically important in biomedical innovation. I'd also like to thank my co-authors at the Brookings Institution, Morgan Romine and Mark McClellan, and at the Deerfield Institute, Alexei Kaze, Celine Audebert, and Jonathan Leff. Today's presentation, I'll be describing our approach to develop a database that can help researchers, policymakers, and others better understand the drug development ecosystem, the drivers of innovation, and potentially assess the impact of new policies on innovation to help identify remaining gaps where new reforms could be focused. So the question we set out to answer was, how can we improve the measurement of biomedical innovation and develop a routinely updated, publicly available database that can help support these topics? Traditional metrics like the ones shown here are often made of counts of things. For example, like the ones in these graphs, the number of new molecular entities approved each year by the FDA, or the trends in research development dollars spent by pharmaceutical companies. Others, like venture capital investment tools, approximations of development times, are part of a list of metrics well known to many of you. And while these efforts to analyze these data shed valuable insights into what's really happening in the innovation ecosystem, as many of you know, it's very challenging to use these kinds of measures to draw any conclusions about what drives development success and what drives innovation and products that really have an important impact on patient outcomes. Where in the process are the stumbling blocks? are new policies and legislative proposals targeting the right areas. In addition, there are also significant challenges to data availability and accessibility. Many researchers interested in analyzing even these more simple metrics go through a painstaking process of searching through public records, industry surveys, collaborating with for-profit data aggregators or other avenues, which is a very burdensome, time and resource-consuming effort. So we developed a rudimentary framework for guiding how we might build a more comprehensive database. This slide depicts the general framework that we're using, and the initial steps represented by the top row includes identifying, validating, and compiling as many data elements as we can on FDA and EMA-approved new molecular entities. This tracks well with many of the traditional analyses that others have pursued over the last several decades. We are especially interested in building this foundational phase around work done by researchers at the FDA and published by Health Affairs in 2013. In that paper, Mike Lanthier and his colleagues harnessed data and expertise at the agency to propose a novel way for further categorizing new molecular entity approval trends into more detailed categories of innovativeness. They used first in class, advancement in class, and addition to class as three distinct subgroups for tracking, and looked at different development metrics within those different classes. We have an interest in our first step to extend this analysis to look at approval times within each phase. So depending on the level of innovativeness, also by therapeutic area, by different expedited drug development tools used like accelerated approval, breakthrough designation, priority review. We'd like to look at all of those and start looking at what the actual time in each phase of development is. However, just like traditional metrics, as I mentioned previously, even these more detailed measures do not really paint the whole picture. This is why we envision our work a multi-phase approach to collect better and more data. For example, the other rows on this table, the third row, for example, measuring the drivers of development success. So we can't just look at approved NMEs to understand what are the drivers of success. We also have to collect data on drugs that didn't succeed, that didn't make it all the way through up to the approval stage. That's a difficult challenge. Some of that data is very hard to collect. Will take a lot of collaboration, but that'll allow us to better understand what really are the drivers of development success. The second row, for example, is even much more labor intensive and gets to actually measuring true innovation. First of all, we need to define what true innovation is, but most obviously it will include the actual impact of these drugs in the patient populations they're intended to treat. What are the quality of life outcomes? What are they really addressing unmet needs? And that'll take developing standardized measures so that we can measure across therapeutic areas and measure as a whole, is our innovation ecosystem actually producing products that are truly innovative and are helping patients with their unmet needs? So finally, we're interested in looking at macro issues within therapeutic areas. So there's many measures that aren't specifically tied to an individual drug. For example, the emergence of public-private partnerships, pre-competitive consortia, developing and validating biomarkers. These things aren't tied to just one drug, but within a therapeutic area can really jumpstart innovation. So we're interested in learning, do those make a difference? Do they really translate to success and innovation? So its next steps are envisioned for this publicly available detailed information on discovery, development, and approval is still a work in progress. There's tremendous opportunities to collaborate with others in this ecosystem and to develop a more systematic process for tracking and improving innovation. This will take strategic partnerships, as I mentioned, partnerships with FDA, with academic groups and research organizations, and trade associations. It will take improved methods for developing and collecting these measures, and potentially collecting these prospectively. Much of these data are retrospective and spotty at best. So if there are drugs that are going through the development process, is there a way that we can prospectively collect data through each phase that would not necessarily be proprietary, but would be available and useful in these kinds of analyses? In the end, we can only really improve biomedical innovation if we truly understand what leads to failure and what leads to success. And hopefully together, Brookings and Deerfield, along with many of you in this room potentially and other organizations, can collaborate on building a better evidence base to evaluate these policies. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a little bit early for me coming from California. When a 7 o'clock alarm at 4 a.m. was difficult to deal with this morning. But I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to thank also Health Affairs for organizing this special publication and this series of presentations that we'll be sharing today. Ken Taton and I took on the ambitious project of looking at biotechnology over the last 35 years. And trying to evaluate its impact, which has been quite dramatic, as some of you may already know, and I will share with you this morning. What we did is we looked at, like I said, the last 35 years approximately, divided into decades, the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, and up to the present, about the middle of last year. And then also looked at it in 4 tracks, looked at the scientific developments, some of the basic science changes, government, activity, business practices and evolution, and the products for patient care. So pretty ambitious. Looking at the 1980s, and I say that's the start or birth of biotechnology only because that's when the first product was approved in 1982, recombinant insulin. And that was the proof of the pudding, so to speak, for recombinant DNA technology as a science, that we can market a product. The first monoclonal antibody was in 1986, orthoclone OKT3. There was one in the 1980s. But it was the proof of principle, again, that we could develop a molecule from the science and make it commercially available. 16 products in the 80s at the beginning, in those early days. I was very fortunate to live during this period in the pharmaceutical and biopharma industry. So it's fun to live it as well as to analyze it post facto now. A hallmark throughout this period up to the present is innovation. That is truly the focus of biotechnology, and it's become the focus for the whole pharmaceutical industry, biotechnology and its innovation, as I will share with you in the next just couple minutes. Unique culture in biotech. I was at Bristol Myers before I went to Amgen. Bristol Myers wore my nice gray suit or your blue suit. You had to always wear your coat. When you could take your coat off when you're on your floor, but when down the cafeteria, you had to take your coat off, put your coat back on. I went to Amgen. The scientists were in shorts, T-shirts, sweatshirts. There was no dress down Friday. Every day was dressed down. But it actually fostered a very different world where the best idea won. You could disagree with your boss at a meeting. It's okay, in interdisciplinary meetings, because the best idea was the most important outcome. Very entrepreneurial environment. And that's true to today. In the 1990s, we really validated this technology, and we validated the business model in biotech. We had 63 products, 78 indications, pretty dramatic changes during this period of time. We became a profitable industry. And pharma noticed that, so started creating alliances with biotech and development of pharmaceuticals. PDUFA was created at that point in time, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which was a very successful act as far as fostering and accelerating the approval of safe and highly and effective products. In the 2000s, innovation again, but now we can say that biotechnology is really a core for the whole pharmaceutical industry in developing new pharmaceuticals and bringing novel products to patients. The pipeline is very active. There's over 1,000 molecules in clinical trials in the United States. Acquisitions is now the hallmark in the 2000s, where there were 51 blockbuster acquisitions. What I mean by that is billion-dollar acquisitions, over 50 of them, of the biotech industry by pharma. And product value is another hallmark of biotechnology. We now can not just resolve signs and symptoms of disease, we can change the pathogenesis of disease, and we can create cures with biotechnology. A dramatic change in the whole biopharma industry. During this time period, the FDA was a participant with us in the industry. Yes, there was more data required. Yes, there was more cost required in the development of pharmaceuticals during these 20, 30 years, dramatic increases, up to $2.5 billion per product now. But also, there was much accelerated approvals, priority reviews, accelerated reviews, breakthrough therapies. So there was facilitation of product approvals of both drugs and biologicals. Product success is very dramatic, as you can see in this slide, that shows us the number of products and second indications of products. A dramatic increase over time, and now it is a sustained increase. So you can see 50 to 60 molecules with each of these 5-year time frames. We can also see now that there was quite dramatic sales success. That's part of that profitability. And this is a slide showing U.S. sales and then also the number of blockbuster products. Again, a blockbuster being $1 billion in sales in any 1 year. If there's success in novel products that help patients, that are also profitable, pharma woke up, and since they couldn't beat us, they bought us, basically, through acquisition. And it's been quite dramatic over time. Pfizer became the biggest company in the world because it bought everybody else, basically. And they've done a good job with that. And this is just the biotech acquisitions, not counting the Warner Lambert acquisitions by Pfizer, et cetera, over time. So it's been a very successful history over the past 30 years and really accelerated in the last decade. And then finally, what are the major health advances? It's been exceptionally dramatic across the whole waterfront of medical disciplines. The tagline or the presentation at the bottom of this slide well represents what has occurred. Novel biotech molecules dramatically altering healthcare for unmet medical needs is routinely the case for really almost all medical disciplines, as we see represented here by the number of products and the number of indications. So with that, I'll close, and I guess we'll answer questions.
I suspect there will be a significant number of questions. I don't want to ask each of our presenters a question. It'll eat up too much of our Q&A time, but I am trying to think, just to kick us off, as I listen to this collection of papers, I'm trying to sort of normalize expectations here. I hear a lot about cycles, ups and downs, good periods, bad periods, high return, low return. Is that, shouldn't we expect that in a dynamic field that involves both the science side of innovation as well as the economic side, particularly, Ernie, your first comment that a lot of the volatility is on the revenue side. I guess I'm just trying to figure out, should we be surprised that there are these different time cycles? Should we be concerned that there are these different time cycles? Or should we say, well, like everything else, there are cycles? Who wants to grab this one and get the conversation going?
Let me start with that. In a way, we shouldn't be surprised. Biologics were enormously successful between 1995 and 2004. Very profitable. What you would expect in response is that industry would allocate investments in that area. In fact, what we've had is a fair number of new drugs in biologics, a fair number of them being orphans. And what economics would suggest is that as you have a greater number of products on the market, this will drive down returns. And that's what we've seen in the most recent cohort. A very interesting question is, since 2009, has there been a change in that cycle? Are we entering a new phase with the Sovaldis and the Harvonis and so forth? My sense is we have to be pretty cautious about that, because while we hear a lot about a Sovaldi, most of the drugs that were approved in the last 3-4 years have not had a very successful track record in terms of revenues. A few drugs are very visible, but others, many others are not nearly as stellar performers. And some of the drugs that were initially very, very promising have turned out to be dogs. Incivek was the first of the hepatitis C drugs. It was going to be the deal breaker. Incivec's manufacturer, Vertex, has now withdrawn the product from the market because Sovaldi is so much better. So we are seeing a certain amount of Schumpeterian obsolescence that is part of a cycle, I think.
Anyone else want to weigh in at this level?
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that I think we'll see those cycles. I mean, we're going to see fluctuations, and that's normal, and that's to be expected. But what we're really trying to get at, I think all of us are ultimately, and it's sort of in the slide there, is major health advances. And I think by studying these cycles and understanding the fluctuations, that can help us then link that to what are the health advantages, what is the true innovation, and can we do things to make that more often? I think that's what we should be driving for.
I can keep asking questions, but I'm also eager to bring you all in. So I see a hand here. Please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and if you all run out of questions, I'll get back in the queue.
Joel Coopersmith. For 8 years, I ran the medical research program. And for Dr. Baker, what you found with macular degeneration is reflected in many other things in the VA. For example, procedural regional differences are similar in the VA as they are outside the VA. They're the same doctors often, especially in the specialties, and particularly they are in academic medical centers. And it seems that the local culture is very deep because doctors will practice similarly in the VA as they do outside and when they don't have an economic incentive, unless the VA takes it on, as it did, for example, with erythropoietin, whose use was much diminished in the VA because there was a top-down, essentially, instruction to do it. So I think your findings are very consistent with many other things, and probably if we looked at other areas outside the VA that might have a similar situation, the local culture, I think, would also predominate.
Any reaction?
No, thank you for the comment. That's, I think, one of the things that we came around to, so I very much agree with the point that you made. We came around to think that it's very important actually to look at this more, and I think, I don't want to say too much for my VA colleagues who have cautioned me that it's a complex system that's doing many different things in addressing these issues. But I think they would suggest also that the actions at the VA administrative level would be probably very important in determining how this would work and how this will go forward.
I'd like to follow up on the Lucentis situation.
Remind us who you are?
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a primary care physician. I'm also an attorney, and I was on the NIH IRB for the Eye Institute when all this was going on. It seemed to me that what Genentech did was very cynical when they found that Avastin could be used for this purpose. Instead of working that up and getting a new indication, they developed a new chemical that was very much like the old one, got the indication for that, never got the indication for Avastin, manufactured and produced it in a way that was much easier to administer in single doses. Is there some way that when this happens, the government could set up a situation where the company was incented to follow on with the less expensive medication instead of using the FDA structure to promote a medication that was much more expensive and didn't cost very much at all to develop?
Well, I'll say a couple things, but I may have colleagues on the panel here who are at least as well positioned to address this as I am. So I'll just say our study accepted the situation as it was and simply looked at the incentives that were facing different players to use the two different drugs. And so we did not particularly take it upon ourselves to answer the question or even investigate the question that you asked. I guess one of the things that the economist in me wants to suggest is that we always hope that market forces eventually will force these prices and products to work themselves out. And so if you offer something that is much more expensive and similarly efficacious, that eventually the less expensive, equally efficacious one would win, but sometimes that takes quite a while, and I have experts here who know more about the incentives and whether we could change those in a way that would have made a difference here. But one still imagines that over the longer run there might be some hope that this would sort of normalize itself in the marketplace.
The speakers on both sides of you focused a lot on how the market is structured and function, not specifically about Avastin and Lucentis, but I wonder if either of you have thoughts about that.
So when I used to work at FDA for 10 years, I saw similar situations. The drug quinine has been used in China for thousands of years. When I was there, a company got it approved for a form of malaria, and the next day tried to get all generic forms of quinine taken off the market. And it's for exactly this. So I think it's what a number of us have been talking about is reimbursement for value, rather than using a regulatory structure to block things that may be similarly or perhaps even more effective, or have a better cost-benefit ratio, similar effectiveness but cost more. I think at least I can relate it to what we did for antibiotics. That's exactly the problem that we're seeing. It's this sales volume link that is actually causing a vast majority of the problems. And it would seem that perhaps a different kind of business model in certain situations where we de-link the sales from volume might be appropriate not just for antibiotics, but maybe for other situations as well.
Yeah, just to build off of John's comments, I mean, I think it's a critically important question, and I'm glad you raised it. Yes, there do need to be some changes to the incentive structure. I think that those are coming. It's not a fast process, but if we look at health reform in general, we are trying to move towards paying for better outcomes and realigning incentives. And so I think the hope is that could create a situation where the market forces are demanding products that really are bringing the right outcomes, but that are also cost reducing, that the therapies are resulting in reducing wasteful spending and increasing patient outcomes. So in that particular situation, maybe the incentives would have been a little bit different in the way that company proceeded with that product.
Question.
Just one other comment.
Please.
Regarding the Lucentis and Avastin issue. We need to keep in mind a little bit in related to product development. I was not at Genentech, and I'm not trying to defend them, but when Avastin was in its phase 3 clinical trials, they already were working on Lucentis in phase 1. And Avastin was being focused in oncology. Because remember, it takes 5, 6, 7 years for a product to get through the clinical research phase. So, the product Avastin was approved. While it was being studied, the other one was already being developed in a totally different indication, so they're focused differently. Now, they may not have handled it all that well once we're both approved, and we learned that both can be used in almost either situation. But at the beginning, they were developing 2 different molecules for 2 different uses, and it was with good intentions. And now, things change down the road in the clinical use of the products.
I had a question here. Can someone get to? Oh, got it.
Hi, I'm Sheila Smith. I'm from CMS. And my question is for Dr. Berndt, but it actually piggybacks kind of neatly onto the discussion that we've been having. And the question is this. Your results show a marked decline in the economic profitability of new medications that are developed. What does this imply about the productivity of both the supply side and the demand side? Because obviously we've got issues here with how new drugs are purchased, whether there's value there, and whether there's sufficient sensitivity to the trade-off between value and cost, and also on the supply side in terms of the way drug companies pursue their research objectives, whether you've got a transition going on here that may result in greater efficiency in terms of the way new products are developed.
Let me try and answer that. The Tufts folks issued their most recent incarnation of the cost of bringing a new drug to market about 2 months ago in November. And one of the things they showed is that there's been very substantial improvement in the standardization, if you will, of drug development, in that if you look at a measure of relative volatility, that is to say something that's called a coefficient of variation, it's the standard deviation divided by the mean, that's fallen quite a bit over time, particularly for phase 3 trials. And I think the number was for phase 3 trials is something like 0.6. If you look at the data on sales, so that suggests to me that there's been a lot of productivity and standardization, and there's much less variability than there used to be in drug development. Where there's enormous variability is on the revenue side. And that suggests to me that probably on the payer side, there hasn't been as much of an improvement in dealing with different drugs and assessing their value. So I would probably say there's been a fair bit of progress from the point of view of developing drugs. Still very costly, but the variability across them has been sharply decreased. By contrast, we see ever more variability in, I think the coefficient variation for a revenue side was something like 1.6, which is about 2.5 times that on the cost side.
And also to add, the industry has evolved a great deal in the last 30 years. Remember in the 80s and especially the 90s, the whole pharma industry was developing blockbuster products for very broad patient populations, the Lipitor example, or Celebrex examples. So millions and millions of patients potentially using the product every year. Now, most everyone is involved also in, and maybe preferentially in for niche markets, much smaller patient populations. And that it has a big impact on trying to get your return on investment. And you're going to charge a hell of a lot more for that product to get that return on investment. So that's a part of the conundrum as well, this change, general change in the kinds of products that are being developed and the kind of opportunities that exist. Major unmet medical needs, but also much smaller population of patients to deal with.
I think we've described the trend from blockbusters to niche busters.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to add is that there seems to be a lack of investment in things that would be tools that would help develop better drugs that could be used more broadly. So for instance, if you look at one of the very first drugs that was approved for influenza, the company developed a patient-reported outcome tool, and then if you read the article, it says, on file Herx, Marion, Russell. They stuck it in a drawer, wouldn't let anybody use it. I've been involved myself in developing a patient-reported outcome tool for influenza, and our sole purpose is to make that broadly available to everyone. And yesterday, BARDA announced that they're going to stick it in every flu trial they're going to use from this point going forwards. The investment we put in to develop that tool will be now spread out across all of those trials. And what I think is very amazing when I watch television is, it seems to me that the marketing people at the companies get it, don't they? They always show people having functional activity in their lives, throwing the football with their kids, riding their bicycle. Those are the outcomes that patients care about. Yet what's concerning to me as a physician is things like the 21st Century Cures legislation are promoting more and more laboratory-based outcomes whose relationship to what really matters to patients is not known, or in fact might not be very good. And then that gets you to the question of, what are we actually paying for? Do my patients want to pay more to alter a lab test, or do they want to pay more to function better in their lives? And then that gets back to my original premise, who's going to pay to develop those better tools? Doesn't seem like anybody really wants to, yet that's a really good investment because it can be used broadly across a number of different areas.
So we have two up front that have been in the queue, and I'll have to see where we are at that point, but
I was deeply unsatisfied.
Okay.
I love the presentations.
Tell us who you are.
I'm sorry, Peter Ubel, Duke University, and I love the presentations, but I was deeply unsatisfied with how you responded with the questions about Avastin and Lucentis. You know, the market isn't going to work this out. When the market, what your study was on was Medicare and the VA. This is not a free market. This is government payers. The problem, the solution could be negotiate prices, say no to drugs that are no better than less expensive ones. I'm stunned that hasn't happened. Love to hear your take. You know, step away from the science here, anybody, and step away from the science and just say, why aren't we just fixing this?
So I was actually going to bring that up at the end, but then somebody else had another question. I was going to bring up the issue of, let's look at how other countries actually do this, right? So if you look, for instance, in the UK, they will approve lots of products, and then it goes to the National Institute for Center for Excellence, NICE, and they say, that's really nice that our regulatory agency approved this. We're not paying for it because it doesn't have added benefit. That has not occurred in this country. My personal view as a physician that takes care of patients is it has to happen eventually. In what form it happens, how it happens may be different than it does in those nationalized healthcare systems where everything's centralized. But my own opinion of this is that has to happen in some kind of way, whereas Greg pointed out we end up paying for value. I actually wrote at the top of my paper, please define innovation, as Greg brought up, right? And I looked it up in the dictionary last night. It doesn't mean new, it means new and better. And so I think until we get to that point that we're actually paying for things that are not just new but also better, that we're going to have to deal with that issue you just raised.
More satisfied now? At least we got it on the table. Yes, please, Nick.
Morning. My name's Kim Slocum. I'm an independent healthcare consultant. It appears to me you've got two questions going on here. One is defining what is value, which is, I think, what you said. The second one is how do we measure it better? And aren't we really being held hostage to the lack of availability of a population-level database that could look at real-world outcomes? Are we simply at a bottleneck, and until the folks in information technology and healthcare get their act together, we're just going to keep debating how many angels dance on the head of a pin?
Yes. So I think it's a big issue that we're working on at Brookings, and we are getting some progress, but there's sort of these niche one-off examples, like for example, Sentinel is doing the FDA Sentinel system is doing some good things. PCORI is trying to build a system that's doing some good things. There are other examples like that, even on the medical device side, which is a little bit further behind, but are making some progress. But what we don't have is a coordinated effort for all of these things to progress together to actually build a system that we say this learning healthcare system, but how do you actually get there? We need a concerted, coordinated effort and financial support to actually build the capabilities to leverage these disparate systems into one more efficient way to do things like coverage with evidence development, to measure better value on products once they're on the market. That could lead and potentially support payment reform and measuring what real innovation is. But that's missing now, and it's something that hopefully with the 21st Century Cures Initiative or other types of upcoming legislative proposals, that there can be some support for taking a step back and looking at across the ecosystem, what are the opportunities to create that more consolidated, more coordinated effort.
And somebody's got to pay for that. I mean, if you go to a country like Denmark, 4 million people, single payer system, smaller, and you can track what happens to everybody there. We don't have that system in this country. In fact, do you realize that the Department of Defense, when you leave the military and you go into the VA, they can't even connect your records together? So even two very linked systems, we have difficulty with that in this country.
So I'm noticing that the more passionate the questions, the more passionate the answers, and the shorter they are. I'm going to try to bring one, and depending on how passionate, we'll get one more.
I don't know if this is passionate. Julie Cantor, Weinberg College of American Pathologist. Great panel. Obviously, you were doing fabulous empirical research, and for that, we're looking backwards. I'd like you to make some predictions given the President's announcement of the Precision Medicine Initiative, and that we're going into an era of more targeted therapeutics tied to the next panel on devices, particularly diagnostics, and what you see might predict will happen.
This may take us to our next panel. So who wants to look forward instead of backward? A number of you looked over enough time, I'm confident you're looking forward to.
Since I answered the last question, I think that the issue of patient-centered medicine is a good one, but it cannot be a smokescreen for saying that we are going to eliminate actual clinical trials that are going to show the benefits in those people. You can actually, when you get to a more heterogeneous population, you can actually do a smaller study because the effects will be greater, hopefully, in that population if the intervention is effective. But as a number of people here have talked about, as the population gets smaller, if reimbursement stays the same, the company makes less money. So there's going to have to be some adjustment for that. And what's happening, as we talked about niche medicine, is that the cost for those niche drugs is going up and up and up. to me, as a physician on the other end of this, I see that as unsustainable, right? So there has to be something that, yes, personalized medicine is a good idea, but we need to think about the downstream effects of that.
Let me just add to that I think this is going to raise a very serious scientific and regulatory set of issues regarding how do you validate these biomarkers and these diagnostics.
Not easy.
And to what extent should that be regulated versus just be sort of a Western frontier and let every diagnostic do what it wants to.
Yep.
So Ron, with this slide up on the screen from your presentation, I want to give you the last response.
Thank you. Pharmacogenetic related studies are with us today. Every company is doing pharmacogenetic studies. Even if you're not doing it prospectively, you're collecting the data in your patients and then doing later potentially some retrospective analyses to see if there's subsets of patients where you have better responses. So it's been done routinely in the industry, all the way across the industry, even pharma and biotechnology today. And the majority of the oncology products that are marketed now are in pharmacogenetic subpopulations. So that's the norm already. But the cost issue is huge because in 2013, 11 out of the 12 oncology products all cost 6 figures. And now you're adding a second 6-figure income on top of a first 6-figure cost. So it's an issue that the industry and healthcare and government has to really wrestle with in the near term. We're not a single-payer system. We don't have the simple solution. And cost, by the way, earlier question with cost effectiveness, that's being done a lot. And actually, for the first time, the industry executives are saying it's okay, it's reasonable to ask that question. It's not required for approval, but it's required by the insurers and often government to generate data to show full value. So that's already being done. We're not there yet. We're a long way off, but it's moving forward.
I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking this kickoff panel. We don't have a formal break built in. We'll do that after the next panel. So I would, if you need to step out, you're going to miss the first couple of minutes. But let's bring our next panelists up. You will hear from Julia Thornton Snider, Senior Research Economist at Precision Health Economics, who is presenting on a paper having to do with robot-assisted surgery. Jeff Lerner, President and CEO of the ECRI Institute, an independent nonprofit that researches the best approaches to improving patient care. ECRI Institute is an evidence-based practice center for ARC and a patient safety organization designated by the Department of Health and Human Services. You'll hear from John Carroll, Professor of Medicine in the Division of Cardiology and Medical Director of the Cardiac and Vascular Center at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. We're turning here toward a discussion around devices away from pharmaceuticals, and then after the break we'll return to some of the broader contextual topics. So let me turn first to Julia.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and to all of you for coming. As you just heard, I'm going to talk about robot-assisted surgery in kidney cancer. But before jumping in, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Amitabh Chandra of Harvard, Yanyu Wu of Precision Health Economics, Anupam Bapujena of Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital, and Dana Goldman of the University of Southern California. So the theme of the day is innovation, and one of the lessons of the research I'm presenting, and also more broadly, is that measuring the value of an innovation is complicated. So for example, let's think about comparative effectiveness research, which is a useful way to understand the relative efficacy of two innovations. And it benefits society to have this knowledge, but it's also important to note that comparative effectiveness research doesn't tell the whole story. So suppose, for example, that there are two treatments, A and B, and according to comparative effectiveness research, treatment A has greater efficacy than treatment B using short-term data. Does this mean that we should always use treatment A? Not necessarily, because in addition to the short-term comparative effectiveness research, we'd also like to know about long-term outcomes for patients taking the two treatments, and we also care about access effects. So imagine, for example, that treatment A can only be provided by doctors at, say, Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston or the Mayo Clinic, whereas treatment B could be provided in any community clinic in the country. In that case, we might actually prefer treatment B in many instances. So the point here is just that while we do obviously value comparative effectiveness research and learn a lot from it, it generally has a short-term focus, and we also care about the long-term, and we care about access. Okay, so back to robotic surgery. Before you can understand this study, you'll need to know a bit about kidney cancer. Kidney cancer is growing in prevalence, and in 2012 there were 58,000 new cases diagnosed in the US. It's generally treated through surgical removal of the tumor. There are two forms of this procedure. There's a radical nephrectomy, in which the entire kidney is removed, and there's a partial nephrectomy, which you can see in the picture, in which just the diseased tissue is removed. And there has been some debate about the relative merits of these two procedures, but there's a growing consensus that partial is preferred for appropriate patients. The nephrectomy surgery can be done as an open surgery with a large incision, or as a laparoscopic surgery with several small incisions and instruments inserted through them, or it can be done robotically. Okay, so over the past decade, there's actually been a large increase in access to robotic technology. You can see that this is from our data. We use SEER cancer registry data linked to Medicare claims data, and you can see the number of regions in our data that had robotic capability over time, and it's been climbing. You can also see here on this green line the rate of partial nephrectomy over the past decade, and that's also been climbing from about 14% in 2002 to about 30% in 2009. So we asked whether these two trends are connected. So basically, has robot-assisted surgery increased access to partial nephrectomy? You might say, back up a minute, why do I care about increased access to partial nephrectomy? And one reason is better survival. In our data, after controlling for a variety of factors, we found that regions with the lowest rates of use of partial nephrectomy had the highest mortality rates. So we found a 11% one-year mortality rate in regions with the lowest use. But we saw that as regions raised their rate of partial nephrectomy, the mortality rate fell to about 7% in regions with the highest use. Of course, mortality isn't all that we care about. We also care about morbidity and quality of life. So we looked at renal failure, and we saw a similar pattern. We saw that in the first month after the nephrectomy, patients in regions with the lowest use of partial nephrectomy had about a 20% risk of renal failure, but as we saw, as regions raised their rate of partial nephrectomy, the risk of renal failure fell to about 12% in regions with the highest use. We saw a similar pattern in the full year following the surgery, and we saw a similar pattern also in the long term. So I'm actually an economist, but speaking with clinicians about this, I think that some intuition for why this is the case is that, to simplify, 2 kidneys are better than 1.5, and 1.5 are better than 1. So if partial nephrectomy preserves more of the kidney, then that leaves patients with better renal function and lower risk of renal failure. So finally, we asked whether robot-assisted surgery increased access to partial nephrectomy, and we found that it did. So again, controlling for a variety of factors, we found that in regions without robot-assisted surgery available, there was about a 15% rate of partial nephrectomy, but as regions adopted robotic capabilities, that rate rose to 23%, and this represented a substantial improvement in the rate of partial nephrectomy, about 52%. Okay, and so for full details, you'll need to see the paper, but very briefly, we did a cost-benefit analysis where we used standard health economic techniques to value the quality-adjusted life years gained, and we subtracted from this the healthcare cost incurred. We did all of this over a 5-year time horizon. And then we compared the benefits of robot-assisted surgery to the costs of acquiring and maintaining the robot. And through this calculation, we found that the benefits outweighed the costs by quite a bit, actually about 5 to 1. So to summarize, we found that robot-assisted surgery increased access to partial nephrectomy, which has been shown to offer reduced mortality and reduced rates of renal failure. We found that the benefits outweighed the costs by a fairly large margin. And it's important to note there that the costs are largely short-term, whereas the benefits accrue potentially over the lifetime of the patient. So say if a study is looking at 1-year costs and 1-year benefits, they could mistakenly come to the conclusion that the costs outweigh the benefits. And in fact, what we found through our literature review is that a lot of studies do look at a time horizon of 1 year or less. Okay, and finally, this study doesn't show whether robot-assisted surgery is better than laparoscopic surgery, but it does show that access matters. So in particular, we found that as robot-assisted surgery disseminated, that it made it possible for a greater number of patients to have partial nephrectomy, and that in turn led to lower rates of mortality and renal failure. And thank you for your attention.
Right arrow.
I got this upside down. Oh, okay. It's important to get things right side up, including the clicker. Okay. My talk's on forecasting. Basically, formal forecasting systems. People want to know what's new, is it innovative, and when is it going to be available for use in patient care. So forecasting for innovative medical devices, pharmaceuticals, clinical procedures, shifts, it concentrates on what technologies might shift the actual modes of care delivery, patient outcomes, costs, technology utilization, infrastructure. Payers and providers are the major users of ECRI's formal system of forecasting. Providers want to know, what will this do to patient care, to our clinical services, to our costs, to our infrastructure? Payers want to know, how do I prepare for new technologies? How do I address requests for compassionate use of investigational technologies? And they may want to use it as part of coverage with evidence development. But we want formal forecasting because we want to go beyond looking at eviscerated organs from animals or consulting the oracle at Delphi. Forecasting has to be a bit more formal than that. In our paper, we look at 3 questions. Are the forecasts that we've done really accurate enough for effective decision making? What variables contribute to inaccurate forecasts, and how can these forecasts, how can the forecasters themselves manage those variables? It's important in human nature to remember that we always remember what we get right, and we forget about what we get wrong. And it's shocking to me that in formal forecasting, so few forecasters have actually assessed their work. There are only 2 studies that we were able to find. And we're therefore opening ourselves up to bias. So in this paper, we looked at 4 forecasts that were done on these 4 technologies that you see on the screen. And we looked at them at a period of time in 2007 in the case for one, and 2010 for others, and then looked back from 2013 and 14 on 2 of these technologies. And these are major technologies used in cancer and heart care. How do we do it? In our forecasting system, we look at 5 different parameters, and they're listed here. And let me give you an example of what they mean. They have actually intricate definitions. But patient use is the extent to which a technology is expected to become standard of care for patients for whom it would be an appropriate option, or health impact, the extent to which a technology is expected to improve health, quality of life, or both for those who receive it. We use a rating system, a 1 to 5 scale, and there's more detail, of course, in the paper about how that plays out. And we use a modified Delphi technique to come up with our ratings. That modified Delphi technique means that we're going out to experts, about 5 or 6 experts, independently consulting them, having them address these 5 areas and rate these 5 areas, come to consensus, and eventually have the independent experts meet together to resolve any differences. So here are our conclusions. We looked at the 4 technologies and 5 parameters. So there are, in a sense, 20 things you could get right or wrong. In these case studies, we got 15 right and 5 wrong. The 5 we got wrong tended to cluster around 2 of the technologies. That was single-room proton beam therapy and TAVR, transcatheter aortic, let me get it right, vascular
valve replacement.
Valve replacement, sorry. It's a little dark here, but I'll shed light on it. We found essentially 3 inaccuracies in our forecasts. And really, they mostly relate to the first with TAVR, which I'm concentrating on because the next speaker is going to talk to you about TAVR as well. In 2010, we predicted that it would take 4 years to get FDA approval because there were ongoing pivotal trials. That didn't happen. The FDA made its decision 14 months after our 2010 assessment. So they approved it far earlier. That was a surprise. And it also led to CMS using a coverage with evidence development process much earlier. So the parameter that really changed was the adoption status. We got that wrong. They surprised us. There were also changes in the process impact that were related to this. We felt it would become more substantial because it had diffused so much earlier and beyond the scope that FDA and CMS thought it would. More institutions were using it. And the financial impact, again, became greater because it had diffused more rapidly. Okay, so here are some takeaway points from our paper. First of all, forecasting is terribly important, and it's a kind of real-world comparative effectiveness research. This is not the comparative effectiveness research of researchers. This is the decision makers in hospitals and in payer organizations that say, I've got this now. Should I get this new technology? And that's a very different definition and a critical one, and why forecasting is used. Again, there is no formal literature, close to no formal literature, assessing these systems. That's a problem, given the importance of forecasting in our own thinking and in the healthcare system. So, although ours was a self-evaluation, what we really need is independent evaluations of forecasting systems. Okay, thanks.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here and to represent the American College of Cardiology, the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, our co-authors and collaborators from the FDA, CMS, the medical device industry, hospitals, and patients. Only a few decades ago, heart valve problems were fading away due to the eradication of rheumatic fever. That trend has been shattered. This graph shows that there's an age relationship to heart valves failing, and that 1 out of 7 individuals over the age of 75 will have a clinically important heart valve failure. There are no known measures to prevent this or to modify its onset. Open heart surgery has been the gold standard for the treatment of heart valve abnormalities, but in this population, often accompanied with other medical conditions, the risks are excessive, and therefore these patients have gone on untreated. Transcatheter valve therapies have been developed, and much like the placement of a coronary stent, this can be done without opening the chest, often with the patient awake but sedated, often with the ability to be discharged within a few days, and a valve can be replaced or repaired with the heart beating. In the past 3 years, 3 novel technologies shown here have been developed, tested in relatively small clinical trials, have achieved FDA approval, and covered by Medicare. When new therapies emerge, though, there is an immediate need, a prospective need, for real-world data to make the next level of decisions in optimizing patient care, making reimbursement and regulatory decisions, improving the therapeutics. In this issue of Health Affairs, we describe the development, the achievements, and the future goals of a clinical prospective registry to change how we learn in a more rapid, efficient, and comprehensive manner. This registry uses a multi-stakeholder model, a private-public partnership, to provide timely and quality data analytics to provide answers and take actions on many of the questions shown here and others. In 354 hospitals in the US offering these therapies, approximately 350 data elements are gathered on the patient, on the procedure, and the outcomes. Importantly, in this age group, in this patient population, it's not whether the treatment will allow a person to live longer, it's whether the quality of life, their functionality improves. And therefore, this is a very unique real-world collection of patient-reported health status that occurs before and after the procedure. Also, these patients are linked to the Medicare claims database such that we can follow long-term outcomes, including rehospitalization rates. Also, risk models have been developed based on the tens of thousands of patients who have initially undergone these treatments, such that we can do a more individualized, a more personalized risk-benefit model to help clinicians, patients, and families make decisions in the coming. Finally, this offers a unique infrastructure for an innovative medical device surveillance system that hopefully will be more comprehensive and less costly than the current system. Our principal goal is to bring, monitor, and continuously improve innovative treatments to US patients that are safe and effective and provide true value to patients. My co-authors represented here from the FDA, from CMS, from the medical device industry, and from the professional societies are committed to making this model successful with the achievements to date described in this manuscript in this issue of Health Affairs. In closing, data lead to new knowledge, but the key next step is to take action. Measurement alone is not enough, and is nicely said in this proverb. The TVT registry structure is unique by incorporating the leaders of stakeholder groups that act on the knowledge that is gained. Please read the article for further details. Thank you.
This time I will kick off the questioning with a little more precision. And Julie, since Precision Health Economics is in the name of your organization, I appreciated your precision at the very end something we struggled with in trying to make sure we were communicating accurately about the paper. Your study does not show whether robot-assisted surgery is better. It's about access to it, and that's complicated. So my question to you is, at the outset, when you were setting the stage for why access matters, you used the example of something available at the Brigham as opposed to available out in the community. It seems to me that, that made a lot of intuitive sense. Then your research is about a technology that surely we can't afford to have in every outpatient setting. Part of the issue here is the high cost associated with it. So given your frame of access, and given that the study is of the benefits associated with access, how do I map the high cost and the limited number of places that can make that investment to the concept of how access translates into better outcomes?
So thanks, that's an excellent question. So, cost is obviously a matter that people pay a lot of attention to when it comes to robot-assisted surgery, but I think that, and it is an important issue, and I agree that it, cost does matter, but I think that there are also costs associated with training doctors to do laparoscopic surgery. What I understand is that it takes a lot of training time, and there are only so many physicians out there that are able to do that. And so, you actually we saw in our data that even in the past decade, the most common type of surgeries being done, in this case for nephrectomy, were open surgeries. So you're not getting the benefits of doing a minimally invasive procedure. And radical still has been more common than partial. So, it's the costs matter, but nonetheless, there are various costs to look at, and also access matters too.
Great, thank you. Jeff, I appreciated your willingness to examine your own performance. I'm interested, I don't know if you've had a chance to read the other papers in the issue. I know it just came out. But in the prior panel, we heard discussion about the need for different kinds of information to help think about the pathway, and that was, of course, focused on pharmaceuticals. So I wonder, rather than trying to go deeper in those 4 case studies, if you could step back and reflect on whether the nature of what you're learning or projecting as you forecast captures what we need, not just to learn what's coming, but to learn things about value and where it fits in the broader patient care system.
Well, thank you. I think there's no question that that's what we want to do. It's the difficulty of doing it in structured ways that I think is very challenging. At ECRI, we're most known for actually quite meticulous, methodologically sound evaluations of technologies where there are randomized trials or other data sets we can look at. We don't have that in forecasting. We're looking so far ahead, there's such limited data, that what we're left with is looking at what human beings, what experts can best judge. And that's interesting because, the ethos of the day is that must be pretty bad. Experts probably don't know what they're really talking about. So I was very curious when, at least in these 4 case studies, where we had this 75% accuracy rate. Now, would it hold up, in other areas? No one knows. But, there are some things, I guess there's almost an analogy, between what computers can do and what the human brain can do. Sometimes there are a lot of nuances that you can capture based on expertise, based on human thinking that's organized, that, you don't get from just pure data. So, I hope it evolves, but right now, this is not a field that has much in it.
All the more reason for evaluation.
Yeah.
John, I was struck by and appreciated your final slide, that measurement doesn't change what the pig weighs. We have some fairly well-established ways of responding to sort of retrospective analysis of costs and benefits, some of which have already been reported today, but they proliferate in the literature. I'm trying to think of the next paragraph or page. You describe a different model for data collection, but then how do we use it? We have well-tested ways to use the retrospective, but surveillance, registries, this kind of, what is the appropriate use of those information, of the information that's gathered there so that it actually does change the weight of the pig?
Yeah. Good question, Alan. I think in the manuscript we described several ways in which it's already impacted different endpoints. You can look at one endpoint being the expanded use of a device in a certain patient population that heretofore was untreated. And using registry data, the FDA did expand the indication for TAVR in a much more rapid process than would ever have occurred had the usual post-market surveillance and system of gathering additional data would have occurred, where it would be a separate clinical trial run by industry, rather than using the infrastructure of all patients undergoing these treatments in the US and being able from that huge data set to derive information on these other patients. So I think that's one of the uses of translating these data into action. I also think it's helping us as clinicians in refining our decision making and the discussions we have from patients as we gather the outcomes, and including the patient reported outcomes on thousands of patients that we're able to more individualize, not on a genetic basis, but on the basis of a variety of clinical factors, preferences they have in terms of what their individual outcomes may be, both in terms of benefits, but also the risks of undergoing procedure. So that's already, I think, translating into action. And certainly we all want to improve the regulatory system, and I'll have to say why Jeff's forecast was off with TAVR and that it got approved quicker. The U.S. was the 44th country in the world to approve this technology, so it wasn't like we won the race of bringing this novel, innovative therapeutic technology to our patients first. We actually were way behind, just completely different than, say, consumer products, where they emerge here rapidly. And so we don't want to go away from the rigorousness of the data that FDA and others, and we all make decisions, but we have to improve the process, and that's really what this registry and this infrastructure is about, a collaboration to improve the process.
So I'm going to see if there are questions. I do want to see if there are those who haven't asked yet. First, I see two here. Let's bring you in and wait for the microphone, please.
Rick Blake, Strategic Health Resources. You guys seem to be working, to me, in a data-rich environment, because we do some overseas stuff where decisions are made by governments spending a whole lot of money with a lot less data-gathering ability. I'm talking about some of the Gulf states, and I would kill for some of the data that you guys regularly collect here, And then since we do regulatory stuff, you could call it not a barren regulatory environment, but an emerging regulatory environment where some of the things that you're doing here have to be created, and then you have cultural challenges, I think, as well. So so my question is then, since healthcare to me is a global concern, not just obviously I'm a U.S. citizen, but it's a global concern when you're working for in that environment. How do you see the impact of what you guys are doing in an overseas environment?
That's great. Any of you?
I'm happy to comment on that since I was just in Dubai at Arab Health. Sure. It's very interesting when you speak with different cultures like the Saudis. They have a definition. They're doing a tremendous amount of building hospitals right and left. They have a lot of money, and they want state-of-the-art technology. Now, their definition of state-of-the-art is different than ours. They want for example, proton beam therapy. Why? Because they want proton beam therapy, and a lot of them. And if you want to work with people in those environments, you can't say, oh, that's the wrong way to think about it, because that's the way they think about it. So what you have to sort of do is say, okay, let's talk about this. If you do buy all of these technologies, how will you use them to patient benefit? So you have to sort of go in that direction with them, because the pure evidence will have no impact, as we see evidence.
So I have two responses to your question. The first is, yes, we are blessed with a data-rich environment, finally, in a prospective manner, and a revolutionary set of new technologies. But it's not without costs. And the major cost is actually in the front line at hospitals, with people having to collect the data. And the electronic medical records of the present version do not allow that process to occur efficiently. It really is a tragedy. And I would say to the healthcare policy makers out there who have some potential to change this is the one thing we need, because data pooling in a variety of areas from across the country will really build this learning process, healthcare system, but without that kind of efficiency, it will remain too costly and unsustainable. Secondly, in terms of the internationalization of these efforts, we are one national registry, and there are national registries in Germany and England and France, Canada, other countries, and we're working toward harmonization of our data elements, definitions, and the FDA has really played a leading role around the world in terms of moving to international registry-based data collection, and important findings have occurred, as in the orthopedic area, where a certain kind of hip replacement was found to be really a problem with the device, and that was detected through an international registry. And so we really think that we'll pick up signals, good and bad signals, by this sort of collaboration.
Yes, please.
Wait for the microphone. Hi, I'm Sue Darcy with The Gray Sheet. We cover medical devices. My question is for Julia Snider. With the partial nephrectomies with the robotic-assisted surgery, did you look at all at the error rate or any adverse events that occurred with it? Because I'm thinking back to what happened with the Da Vinci device. You know, it came on the market really quickly, and then later on there was problems with it, and I think a lot of it had to do with training. Although you said there was problems with training with the other types of surgery too. So I was just wondering if you investigated that at all.
So I think that's a great question, and one of the limitations of this data was that we didn't have procedure level information about which surgeries were done laparoscopically versus robotically versus open, but what we did know was where robots were adopted. And so that's why we were able to look at what happens in areas when robots are adopted to outcomes there. So I think, you know, the type of data that you're talking about would be useful to have, but that was beyond the scope of what we did.
We can fit one more. Let's get the gentleman back here.
Good morning. Neil Wasserman, Time Wave Analytics. We focus on behavior change issues in connection with healthcare. And I wanted to bring that aspect into the mix. So if you were looking at the factors that might influence patient outcomes, the character of the device, the quality of its implantation or configuration is one set of factors. But then what happens to the patient after the device is implemented may also have a role. So there's an issue in terms of how you may structure investment from the provider standpoint and the payer standpoint between investment in the device and investment in the continuing care of the patient. Can you comment on how an integrated strategy might be incentivized, perhaps better than it is now?
Complicated question. Who wants to take it?
I think the development of risk models in terms of predicting a patient's outcome, both mortality and their ability to be alive and feel better, is important. How that information will be used, I'm not sure on a regulatory or an incentive basis. To me, if you present data to clinicians and to the patient and to the family about their potential outcomes, they often make amazingly sophisticated questions, especially in this age group that's weighing a variety of different variables that perhaps are not weighed in younger age group, where it's not about just staying alive another decade, but it's the burden of the therapy, the quality of the life. And so I think with being able to personalize, individualize risk assessment and benefit assessment, people will make more informed decisions. And that's really where we want to go with this, rather than providing a blueprint for a more bureaucratic decision based on outcomes of who gets the therapy, who doesn't get the therapy.
Well, it seems to me that most of the technology you're talking about, at least as I interpret it, is implants. So that's a very special case where the technology is inside the person, it belongs to them, it's a part of them. Your artificial knee's in you, a CT scanner is not in you. And that sets up a very interesting, different dynamic for what people ought to know and where they ought to participate in the decision about what goes into them and what their follow-up care is as well. In our current system, patients know nothing about quality or cost of the devices that are implanted in them. So it's far from a free market concept or system, and there's certainly no data available to them. So you haven't even got the basics in place for really evaluating the worth of these technologies at an individual level, at a consumer choice level. That's a shame. I think that could change. There are movements towards transparency. It's kind of slow, but there are some.
Actually, Matt Brennan at Duke received a PCORI grant using the TVT registry data to specifically work on this, of developing tools for patients, translating this huge amount of data on patient outcomes to usable forms for patients to make more informed decisions. So I think PCORI, using our infrastructure, that's really what we'd like to see happen more and more.
Yeah. I think that ultimately what we want to pay for is health and not healthcare. But then the question, of course, is how to do that. And I think that's just inherently going to have to be very context specific, as you can't have a general definition of health that will cover every patient in every situation.
So we're coming up on what will only be a 10-minute break, but I know you need it, as do we. We do have two panels after on diffusion of innovation and financing. Before we take that break, please join me in thanking our three presenters. Papers that discuss the issue of innovation, acceleration, and diffusion. Those of you in the back, if you could come and take a seat, or otherwise not get in the way of the proceedings. We're going to hear first from Peter Ubel, the Madge and Dennis McLaughlin University Professor of Business, Public Policy, and Medicine at Duke University. Genia Long is a senior advisor at the Analysis Group, an economic, financial, and strategy consulting firm. And Aaron Kesselheim is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics in the Department of Medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. So let me turn the microphone over to Peter.
Hey, good morning. In 2009, the United States Preventative Services Task Force said it could no longer recommend that women aged 40 to 49 should get annual mammography. Now, it took a long time to get this innovation, this practice of annual mammography, to be adopted by practitioners. I'm going to talk about an opposite problem. How do you get people to de-innovate? How do you take what looked like a promise of an important advance in medical care when people come out and say we shouldn't be doing it anymore? How do you get people to back off on that? And this is what David and Ash and I wrote about in our paper. And we think this is an asymmetric challenge, that as hard as it can be to get, when things are beneficial to patients, to get providers to adopt those innovations, it may even be harder to de-innovate, to get people to stop doing what they're used to doing. And we're going to talk about kind of the psychology and behavioral economic forces that make that hard to do. One other example of this is actually prostate cancer screening, when the same task force came out in 2012 and said the harms of screening outweigh the benefits. The response from the American Urologic Association was, "How dare you say this?" I'm paraphrase, clearly. In fact, when the task force recommended against mammography, the response from the American College of Radiology was, "This is strong disagreement." Passionate, yeah. Many people say, well, there's obvious reasons for this. Money is one of them. And urologists make money treating prostate cancer. Radiologists make money doing mammograms. So no wonder there's resistance to it. And of course, that's a factor. There can be unclear evidence. Like, well, it's hard to know whether these things are good or bad. So as long as there's controversy, it's going to be hard to kind of definitively come to one side or another. What David Ash and I wrote about is some other factors we think are also important that are less often discussed. One is something psychologists call confirmation bias. A famous example of this was a study where they took people, some who were in favor of capital punishment, some who were against capital punishment. They had them read two hypothetical studies. One that would show that capital punishment deterred crime, and another study that showed that it didn't deter crime. And they changed which order they did and which study design was for or against capital punishment. And then they looked to see what happened. And you'd think when you see evidence both for and against something, at the end you're going to be a little closer together in the middle. What they found was that at the end of seeing the two studies, these people were more polarized in their views. That if I'm a fan of capital punishment, when I see the study that is against capital punishment, I see all the flaws in the design. When I see a study that supports what I believe, it's a brilliant study. And so this kind of thing, when we see evidence, we don't see it without our own biases influencing the way we perceive them. And so when evidence comes out saying we shouldn't be doing something we've been doing for a long time, those of us who've embraced that practice see all the flaws in the arguments and the logic and the evidence that led to that new recommendation. Another reason it's hard to de-innovate can be that we as a practitioner, say, see a biased subsample of patients. Now, as a primary care physician, I typically don't see many patients with prostate cancer. When I do, they often have mild disease. I see patients who had elevations of that PSA blood test and have terrible side effects from treatments or testing. If you're a urologist, every once in a while you see someone come to you with advanced prostate cancer who never got screening, and you have to just think, horror of all horrors, we have to avoid this. So we see different subsets of patients, and that biases our interpretation of how beneficial any kind of practice is. And so when you remember often the worst cases that you come around in life, and those then have a disproportionate impact on how you think about the controversy. Then there's a problem of misattribution of causality. I had a kidney cancer about 1.5 years ago. Julia, I had it removed with robotic assistance. The question is whether removed with that cancer saved my life or not. And the answer is we don't know. If I get run over by a bus tomorrow, then that surgery will have been a waste. And when many older people have kidney tumors, some people think we should watch them more. When people with abnormal mammograms have tumors removed, some of those are precancerous lesions that might never have done anything. And yet everybody who goes through some terrible procedure to remove some cancer that may or may not actually hurt them in the long run believes that what they went through saved their lives. And so that leads to a strong advocacy community saying we can't take away mammography screening or PSA screening. And finally, the other I want to talk about is a phenomenon called the endowment effect. Study went where they gave a group of students, half of them got a coffee mug and half didn't. They held a mug in their hands for like 30 seconds, and then they said, hey, everybody who has a mug, how much would you be willing to sell it for? And those of you who don't have a mug, how much would you be willing to pay to get the mug? It turns out you'd think it should be about the same price. But the people who had the mug in their hands already only would part with it for substantially more money than the people who didn't have mugs were willing to part with. That once you've held something into your possession, it means more to you. And so imagine that you've embraced not just a coffee mug, but a practice like doing annual mammography or routine PSA screening. When someone comes along and says, you shouldn't do that anymore, like, you're just taking something away from me that I've learned to love. And that's really hard for people to do. How do we overcome resistance to de-innovation? Dick Thaler, one of the really fathers of behavioral economics, says, when you can't de-bias people, re-bias them. I think it's really good. He's very pithy, right? So we all have biases. It's hard to pull away from them. So sometimes what you want to do is have people with different biases around the table together. I think to its credit, the American Urologic Association, when it first vehemently came out against the task force guidelines, went and convened an expert panel to look at the situation. And on that panel, they brought together people from a wide range of perspectives, including primary care physicians, including people, epidemiology, statisticians, et cetera. And they came around with guidelines very similar to what the task force came with. And I think it was partly having people with different biases led to a less biased group decision. I think another thing we can do to avoid the de-innovation problem is not to innovate too quickly. An example is a thing called therapeutic hypothermia. Means when someone's heart stops, bring their temperature way, way, way down, and they're more likely to recover when you try to restart their heart without brain damage, et cetera. That worked in people with the kind of heart rhythms you have a chance of turning around. Immediately it became common practice for anybody whose heart stopped for any reason, even ones where there's little chance of benefiting them. We kind of innovated too quickly, and so it's going to be hard to ever take away from those group of patients. Bottom line, I think, is when evidence and evidence-based guidelines fail to get people to abandon old behaviors, it's not just stubborn self-interest that keeps people from de-innovating, it's some basic psychology, it's human nature. Thank you.
We clearly have the nicest panel. All right, let's see if I can get the... All right. Well, first of all, on behalf of my co-authors, who sadly could not join us today, Henry Grabowski of Duke and Joe DeMasi of the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, who's obviously getting a lot of play. Tufts is today. And I want to thank the editorial group and all our colleagues here for having such a wonderful and interesting and stimulating conversation. So we really focused, to kind of go back a little bit, Alan, as you were saying, kind of to the sort of the fundamentals on the economics of innovation in the drug development world. So really kind of I think a complement to the very important paper that Ernie summarized kind of earlier this morning. We looked at backing up a little step to talk about the importance of patents and other forms of IP protection in the innovation sort of ecosystem within drugs. We reviewed targeted incentives that complement the general provisions that we're generally sort of familiar with, and considered some of the sort of pros and cons, or some of the considerations in mandatory and voluntary or opt-in kinds of supplements or alternatives to the existing structure that we have, and just generally sort of the balance that fundamentally these kinds of provisions are looking to strike, which is on the one hand between the goal of providing an adequate incentive for continued innovation in future new therapies, kind of bringing those to getting adequate investment in those to bring them to market throughout an extended development process, and on the other hand, price active, very passionate and active price-based competition when that period of protection really ends. And that's fundamentally how our existing system works today. So before we kind of talk about some of those sort of nuts and bolts and what role they kind of play in the larger system, backing up to, in fact, as I was thinking before, some of the topics that Ernie really raised this morning from a more updated, kind of perspective in the groups of cohorts of drugs that he looked at. Biopharmaceuticals are really characterized by a unique set of economic characteristics, and I kind of go back to frequently a comment that Judge Posner noted skeptic of sort of where IP protections and more stronger IP protections sort of make sense, and where you really want to be looking at them carefully. He really singled out sort of this area of the world as really being one that is kind of the poster child for why you need IP protection in order to provide adequate incentive for innovation, broadly, kind of broadly speaking. And that is, as we've been talking about earlier today, that as we know, the R&D process is extensive. Using the data from my colleague Joe DeMasi and Henry and their colleagues' most recent update to the cost of drug development, the R&D process really takes more than a decade from synthesis to approval. It's obviously, as we know, very extended. The most recent estimates in that same study identify the out-of-pocket costs, let alone sort of the capitalized sort of portion, but just the out-of-pocket costs associated with new drug approval at over $1 billion. It's at approximately $1.4 billion, then another 460 plus million post-approval. So the amounts of resources we're talking about are extensive and highly risky, not just in the development process where only 1 in 8 drugs that begins clinical testing completes that process and actually makes it to market, but commercially as well. The top quintile of sales really makes up the dominant portion of the sales pool that we really have. So as a result, really the few have to pay for the many. And moreover, once patents and regulatory exclusivity expire, generics, of course, in our world rapidly enter. So a year ago, in 2013, about 86% of all U.S. prescriptions were represented by generics, and in fact, in the 2011-12 period, it was even higher for those drugs that had recently lost protection and had sales over $250 million, so very significant. Overall, sort of the point really is that without kind of IP protections, firms would be very unlikely to undertake, that level of investment. We know, of course, also that IP protections serve other sort of important economic functions really around asset allocation, particularly if you think about the level of development of a vibrant, diverse ecosystem of startup, technology, and molecule-focused companies. Really, IP protection and the valuation is essential to the valuation of those firms and to the attraction of capital. So it's essential. When we talk about the patent-based system, we're talking about a combination of both patents and regulatory exclusivity, and it's really the combination of those provisions, both general regulatory protection, specific regulatory exclusivity we'll talk about in a second, and patents that interact to create really an overall market exclusivity period. And that's really, in some sense, complementing what Ernie talked about this morning, the critical metric from a commercial point of view. That is the commercial lifetime of a drug, which ranges between 12 and 13 years, sort of, and has since 95 or so. In addition to these general provisions, however, Congress has really over time created a toolkit, let's call it, of more targeted provisions to deal with specific gaps in those sorts of incentives where we really have a particular public health or social interest in identifying particular areas where those general provisions may be inadequate. So for instance, orphan drugs we've talked about a bit today, and those provisions have been very successful and effective in attracting capital investment into drugs treating orphan indications. We think about both push and pull incentives, push incentives being those that reduce the costs of innovation, or development, and pull incentives that increase the potential revenues associated with those development sort of activities. So we see the ranges of things from tax credits to extended exclusivity. Pediatric studies, which Congress recently made permanent, are another area where we've seen the very substantial effect on investment associated with those. I'll just finish, I think, by at the very end, noting that while some have proposed sort of replacement, a very substantial replacement of the existing patent and regulatory incentive-based system with prizes and government contracts, things like that. There are areas where those can make a lot of sense, particularly where I'm talking about, let's say, voluntary opt-in systems or prizes. but they certainly have, and we've identified some areas where those have particular limitations. So overall, debate continues on the best way to balance effective incentives for both widespread and in a more targeted way to address gaps, and on the other hand, rapid and effective generic competition, and in the future, biosimilar competition.
So thanks very much, and thanks very much to Health Affairs for inviting me and for hosting these sorts of events, which are very unique in the medical publishing, medical academic field. So I'm going to talk to you today about transformative drugs. The holy grail of drug research and development are transformative drugs, innovative drugs that have groundbreaking effect on patient care. So myself and my co-author Jerry Avor and Tina Tan sought to ask, where do transformative drugs come from? We studied the development history of 26 drugs and drug classes judged to be transformative in a national survey of expert clinicians at top U.S. academic medical centers in 15 medical specialties. We examined their primary sources, peer-reviewed articles, and conducted interviews with the key innovators who contributed to the discovery and development of the given drug, and outlined where the key innovative concepts arose from. We found three major recurrent themes. First, the centrality of academic innovators in the development work, the prominence of repurposed drugs, and the number of drugs for rare diseases that had a paradoxically broad effect. So first, many of the transformative drugs were based on substantial discovery and development work performed at publicly funded research centers. This work was sometimes aided by industry collaborators who provided samples and other technical or scientific support. And of course, once pivotal trials began, both industry and academic physicians and scientists were almost always closely involved. One common pattern of interactions include academic scientists conceptualizing a therapeutic approach based on research about disease mechanisms and demonstrating proof of concept. So for example, in the case of Epogen, over 70 years elapsed between the discovery of the product in the human body and its purification in the University of Chicago by Eugene Goldwasser, who also proved its effect in a small clinical trial. With Goldwasser's help as a consultant, Amgen researchers cloned the gene over a decade later and produced large quantities of the biologically active product, leading to its approval. One variation of this theme that we saw were that seminal scientific concepts first arose in university settings and were later followed up in the industry setting. The discovery of SSRI antidepressants dates back to the 1960s, when Arvid Carlsson and his colleagues in Sweden investigated serotonin's role in depression. They synthesized the first SSRI, zimelidine, showed its efficacy in treating depression shortly after. In parallel, starting in the 1970s, a research team at Lilly designed and tested fluoxetine, the first SSRI to be FDA approved. The second major theme was the prevalence of repurposed drugs, originally studied for an indication unrelated to the use for which they became transformative. One pathway was through the rediscovery of retired drug compounds. So zidovudine was first synthesized in 1964 at the Karmanos Cancer Institute and tested as an anti-cancer agent and later a herpes virus, but failed and was shelved by Burroughs Wellcome. In 1984, Sam Broder at NCI solicited drug submissions for companies for anti-HIV candidates. Zidovudine's activity was the highest, and clinical trials were promptly started at NIH in collaboration with Burroughs Wellcome and clinical scientists at Duke University. Drug repurposing also occurred via redirection towards a new indication. For example, for many years, inhibitors of the cytokine TNF were used as antisepsis and anti-cancer agents but showed no efficacy. Meanwhile, immunologist Mark Feldman at University College London documented expression of TNF in rheumatoid arthritis patients, and through a personal contact at Centocor, a company that had in-licensed anti-TNF monoclonal antibodies from NYU, Feldman and his clinical partner, Ravinder Maini, received a sample to study 20 patients with rheumatoid arthritis who showed immediate and lasting improvement. A third pattern was through the discovery of unintended favorable secondary effects. So Botox is a neurotoxin derived from a bacterium originally used in biologic warfare and was originally approved for treatments of conditions of hyperactive extraocular muscles, when a practicing Canadian ophthalmologist noted an interesting secondary effect that her patient's frown lines disappeared. This became the basis for the drug's transformative role in cosmetic dermatology. The third major theme was the large number of transformative drugs that were approved as orphan drugs intended for rare diseases. Some became transformative not only for the rare disease patients, but also because they opened up therapeutic pathways or established new understandings of disease. Imatinib was discovered primarily by Brian Drucker at Dana-Farber University and was revolutionary for proving that modulation of tyrosine kinases was possible, ushering in the era of targeted therapy, even though it itself was approved for a rare condition. So we found that the key concepts and insights underlying the creation and transformative effect of certain drugs, such as the concept that TNF blockers can curb the inflammatory response of diseases, or that blocking angiogenesis can kill tumors and treat macular degeneration, arose in publicly funded academic or government settings, which contrasts with the common perception that major drug discoveries come from particular manufacturers. This is not surprising, since the fraction of drug sales that manufacturers devote to R&D is well under 20%, with the amount spent on basic research that generates truly innovative new compounds estimated to be as little as 3%. These findings do not negate the often vital role played by drug companies in the development of new drugs. We found that collaborations occurred between industry scientists to move forward with a seminal discovery into product development. But our findings do not support the concept of the pharmaceutical industry as the single most important source of transformative drug development. Correct attribution, the problem in general is that, with the attribution issue, is that a lot of these seminal concepts can't be patented. And so since we rely on patents as a way of assigning research revenues, that ends up leading to a lot of the credit being assigned to the pharmaceutical companies who end up holding the patents in their hands. Correct attribution of the discovery of transformative drug products can have important effects on policymaking. Those who argue that research within companies is the main source of innovative drug products use this claim to justify high prescription drug prices. And as a result, proposals to promote drug innovation often focus on providing greater incentives for drug producers by extending patents or reducing regulatory barriers for approval, rather than greater support for research that is so often the cause of the innovative therapeutic ideas. By contrast, reductions in NIH funding and industry support for its own laboratories have threatened the funding streams that we found actually did support most transformative drug innovation. The successful repurposing of many drugs in our sample raises the prospects that this pathway is a good means of creating breakthrough innovations, but repurposing has been limited by retention of proprietary rights by pharmaceutical companies, even with respect to compounds not being pursued due to business or other non-clinical considerations. The National Center for Advancing Translational Science at the NIH has tried to make some inroads into this by trying to pool compounds that are not currently being used, but are still their intellectual property rights are still being held by companies. The success of drugs for rare diseases in broadly transforming clinical care suggests that greater investment into research for rare disease treatments may uncover more transformative drugs. Further research could help parse whether transformative orphan drugs are different from other drugs for rare diseases that only have a modest impact on patient outcomes or are later found to be unsafe and removed from the market. So I guess to overall summarize, our results show that transformative drugs historically emerge from places that current day policymakers and business leaders have traditionally undervalued, including government investment in academic-based science, older products that have failed early testing and may be nearing the end of their patent-protected exclusivity periods, and drugs for rare diseases. Thank you.
Great. Let me kick off with a few questions. Peter, you talked about rebiasing because you can't undo bias. This morning there was discussion about rethinking the concept of innovation or reframing it around value, and particularly the value to the patient. I wonder if part of the rebiasing that would help yield de-innovation when needed is the change of the frame to more of a patient definition of outcome. Could that be an ingredient in the rebiasing so that it's easier to de-innovate?
I doubt it.
Okay.
I doubt it. I mean, I think that's what the task force tried to do with its 2 recommendations about prostate and mammography screening, was to talk about the harms of these tests. And the problem is that those harms have to compete with very compelling stories. These statistical harms have to deal with very compelling stories, partly of people who are benefited and also by a lot of people who think they are benefited. So it's tough.
Fair enough. That's why I asked. Genia, your chart of different targeted interventions on top of patent and exclusivity included some things we've talked about today. You had antibiotics and also orphan drugs, and those have both come up. I just wonder if you could help us map the broad frame of intellectual property with those more targeted interventions. Which one dominates? Do the targeted pushes and pulls, do they sort of supersede and offset the impact of the overall regulatory framework, or do they intersect? How should we think about that?
I think as always, the answer is usually it depends, and I think in this case that's also true. I think when companies are really making these tough calls, because the question is really against a diverse portfolio of potential investments, how quick, where's the money going to go, and how quickly are the resources going to advance a program? I think they take a pretty holistic approach, and I think that's what our research in the past, certainly in other areas, more statistical rather than qualitative, as what we have here, has shown that for a particular molecule, any one of these more targeted incentives can make a big difference. If we go back to the early days of the biotech industry, orphans clearly had a really important incentive effect in that world in particular, really kind of jump-started a lot of those programs that otherwise would have really had a tough time. Maybe kind of going back to the point I raised before, also really important in communicating that expectation to investors. So that was hugely important in the early days of biotech, I think, on the orphan side. Remains important, but was really a standout there. Pediatric, I think, has also had an important effect on particular molecules. But frankly, I think when it comes down to it, it's the blend that really matters. And for a particular molecule, the question is, what is this quilt of particular, this sort of patchwork of a variety of incentives put together going to really mean for a program? So if the expectation is that I'm not going to get 10, 12, or more years of a commercial life, balanced by the size of the population and price, it's really a concern.
Aaron, I could follow the pathway from the sources of significant innovation to concerns about resource allocation, and that particularly cuts to NIH funding would, as based on your work, suggest a real risk. I want to ask a slight variant on that, which is the structure, not just the level. So the question is, you don't just point to places where innovation occurs, but you point to processes by which significant innovation occurs. Is there anything about the process you describe that has implications for the how or and type of funding as distinct from the level and who gets it?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, in our studies of these drugs, we found that a lot of these drugs tended to arise from individual scientists thinking outside the box, trying to innovate, and struggling in some ways even to come up with grant funding from public sources. So I think there is a lot of self-reflection that NIH and other public sources need to do to make sure that they are not ossified in their funding mechanisms, but are able to recognize innovative thinkers and researchers and scientists when those kinds of people come up. I think that there certainly is a lot of work that can be done to try to make sure that we direct funding to the right people as well.
Let me open it up to folks in the room. Mark?
Thanks. Mike Miller. I'm an independent physician, health policy consultant. And I wanted to ask Peter if he could sort of flip around his bit of discussion. Yeah, no, you don't have to spin like the top. You were talking about de-innovation, but under the concept of all the stuff that's being developed, transformative drugs, and everything else, don't do anybody any good unless they're used. You're mentioning the polarization when people were given information just to reinforce their biases. I heard a talk a few weeks ago about that being a problem with people who don't want to get their kids vaccinated. They have some concept that it's unsafe, and they're told all the information about how safe it is, and it just rings that bell that there's a safety concern, and it reinforces their resistance to getting vaccinated. So can you talk about sort of the social, psychological factors you talked about as a way to get people to use more things that we know are innovative and really add value, whether it's vaccines or colonoscopies or other things like that?
Broad question. I'm trying to think of what's the best, short answer. It's, I think that often, so innovation, it's often there's things that really work and they get adopted too slowly. And so there's no doubt I'm looking at the other side of that coin, what I was talking about it. I think it's so context specific. If you look at vaccines, They were widely adopted. They were de-adopted in weird ways because of one really awful study published by a very prominent journal, and then a bunch of kooks who've been promulgating it. So it's hard to make a general comment, I think, about how to promote adoption. So lame answer, sorry.
Go ahead, right here.
To the last speaker, I think the process is much more complicated than you've given, and I'm sure you realize this. Discoveries can have 100 origins, starting from somebody who discovers an enzyme to another person in another country who discovers how to block the enzyme, to another person who uses the same way of blocking that enzyme on another, and so forth. It can go on, for a long time before it gets to discovery. And I think there's another big issue besides the issue of, quote, relevant versus non-relevant research, which the NIH is facing, and that is getting the right information to people amidst a tremendous sea of information that's out there. Often, the person who could use the information doesn't get it and doesn't know how to find it, and it's difficult to find. And I think that's another part of this puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I had 5 minutes to talk and 4,000 words to write this article, but I am going to be expanding on a lot of these themes in longer form. And I think that you're exactly right. A lot of these discoveries are not, are not easy to cone down and do a specific number, which is why we sort of took this qualitative approach and tried to look at where the innovative concepts come from. And I think also the idea of trying to share information and making sure that somebody in one lab somewhere can build on the information from people in another lab somewhere else is very important. And I think that a lot of the physicians and scientists who we spoke to who are working at that level expressed some frustration at the growth of intellectual property and patenting that is occurring at the academic level, in response to the fact that most of the revenues for a lot of these transformative products ended up going to the person who took the final baton and moved it to the end point. And so as a result of that, there's a reaction is to try to promote intellectual property and proprietary rights at earlier stages, which is something that's putting a lot of barriers into these kinds of interactions that you talk about that are so important in fertilizing transformative drug development.
Our last question here, yes.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. It seems to me that if you put together the talk from Genia and the talk from Aaron, that it really, or Aaron's talk in particular, that it really wouldn't hurt the innovation process if pharmaceuticals made less money from their product, if a lot of the research, the important necessary research, is actually done in academia.
I'm going to jump in actually real quickly. I think one way to think about it is, what companies care about is the risk. That you invest a huge amount of money with a very low yield, and so the more that that research is teed up and brought to the last quarter of a mile, and you're just taking the baton at the last end, I think if you know your risk is lower, you'll tolerate lower profits, knowing you're going to have some profits. And so I don't mind a system that promoted much more investment in basic science and more price regulation on the other end. I would have no problems with that.
So just building on that a little bit, I don't see anything that we have in our system now that would actually affect that, because once the drug is approved, the pharmaceutical companies are going to try to get as much profit as they can for their shareholders, and no matter how much risk led up to that is not going to make a difference when the system is not set up in a way to reflect that in the price of the product. So I too support your idea of moving towards a way where we can correctly provide adequate compensation for risk, and I don't think we currently do that.
I guess the thing I'd push back maybe on 2 points to the points that Aaron just made. One is we have the beginnings of a system. It's really on the payer side of things to reflect value in price, right? So there's a huge difference, obviously, between list price and net price. Companies get paid in net price. I think it's not quite right to say we have a system that has no pressure on price from value now. We have a system that in each individual therapeutic area, as we have additional molecules enter, there is pressure on price. And I think that's another reason why it's important to think about not just the subset of drugs that might be characterized as fundamentally transformational, but also the full set of drugs across, across the distribution. So I don't think I'd agree with that completely. I guess the other issue I might push back on sort of a bit is, while I think it's a bit of a straw man to describe either basic research being done in academia, tailing off into lesser investments as the process goes goes along, or on the other hand, research getting done on a variety of commercial sides as being exclusive. Both need the other. The only way the system works, I think, is that we have a continuum of investment from basic, where a greater proportion of that investment is made in academia, to translational, to applied, all the way through development. And that combination of investments, with as much as we can get in terms of feedback loop and communication across those, is kind of what makes the system go.
So I would push back a little bit on the pushing back by saying that I think that we have, I agree that there is certainly rudiments of a system to try to do that, but we hamstring our payers to such an extent. We don't allow Medicare Part D to negotiate. We have restrictions on formularies for Medicare and Medicaid. We have a competitive system where one private company needs to compete against another private company, and there are such restrictions on the ability to compete. This isn't a competitive market for pharmaceuticals or medical products. This is a very poorly competitive market, and as a result, you get the Lexapros of the world and the Nexiums of the world and all these follow-on drugs and non-transformative, relatively unimportant products that make billions and billions and billions of dollars and waste the system. And then I would totally agree with your idea, with the second pushback that you had there about the fact that both sides need each other, and that that this is a spectrum. And I think that we should be moving, trying to figure out ways of trying to encourage that. But I would say that in our current system, we excessively, disproportionately reward the latter end of that spectrum.
Well, we have a lot more to talk about the ecosystem of innovation on our final panel, so please join me in thanking these speakers, and without a break, we're going to keep going. Okay, we've made it this far, but we're talking about financing at the end. We figured that would keep you here. We're going to hear from James Chambers, investigator at the Center for the Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health at the Institute for Clinical Research and Health Policy Studies at the Tufts Medical Center, and assistant professor of medicine in the School of Medicine at Tufts University. Jamie Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, was one of our theme advisors, is the Leonard Schaefer Professor of Health Economics and Director of the Berkeley Center for Health Technology at the University of California, Berkeley. John Hernandez, Divisional Vice President of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Abbott Vascular in Santa Clara, California, responsible for global health economics, outcomes research, and reimbursement initiatives. And Jonathan Fleming, President and Treasurer of the Network for Excellence in Health Innovation, or NEHI. I will turn it first to James.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is James Chambers, and I'm an assistant professor at Tufts Medical Center in Boston. The title of my presentation and the title of the paper is Medicare is Scrutinizing Evidence More Tightly for National Coverage Determinations. So today you've got an Irishman trying to explain how Medicare make decisions, so I'm sure you weren't expecting that when you came today. In this study, my co-authors and I examine how the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, is using evidence when making national coverage determinations for medical interventions, and if their interpretation of the supporting evidence base has changed over time. I'd like to thank my co-authors for the input into the study and for AdvaMed for the generous support of this research. Okay, so what did we do? Well, we focused on coverage, and what do I mean by coverage? Well, before Medicare beneficiaries have access to a medical intervention or technology, CMS must choose whether to cover it, or in other words, decide whether or not to pay for it. That is, even for medical technologies deemed safe and effective by the FDA, the technology must also meet CMS's reasonable and necessary standard before it is available to Medicare beneficiaries. Now, we focus on Medicare national coverage determinations in this research. Now, while CMS assessed coverage of most medical interventions through local coverage determinations made by 12 Medicare administrative contractors, national coverage determinations are reserved for big-ticket medical interventions. That is, those interventions, or NCDs are reserved for those interventions deemed particularly controversial or of a significant impact on the programme. Now, the reason why we chose to focus on NCDs is because of the transparency, and because of this, they provide a rich source of data for a set of highly relevant decisions. Now, for this research, we developed a data set of all the clinical studies and other inputs considered by CMS in NCDs. And using this data set, we examined how these decision inputs have influenced coverage in national coverage determinations, and to determine if the restrictiveness of coverage policy has changed over time. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, we went to the CMS website and identified and reviewed each piece of evidence reviewed by CMS in each NCD. So this was a huge task. So for example, for a particular NCD, we identified all randomized controlled trials reviewed by CMS. Then for that RCT, or that randomized controlled trial, we reported how many patients were included in the study, were the study findings favourable towards the intervention on the review, and various other attributes of that randomized controlled trial. Now, we repeated this for all other decision inputs, including non-randomized controlled trials, clinical reviews, clinical guidelines, input from professional societies, input from patients, among a variety of other factors. So it's a very rich data set that we have. Okay, so this data set of decision inputs that CMS used when forming their decision. Now, with this information, we have this very rich data set that allows us then to tease out just how is CMS using evidence when making coverage decisions. And we do that through a set of regression analyses. Now, regression analysis allows us to examine the association of the outcome variable, in this case whether CMS chose to cover the intervention, with each explanatory variable. For instance, the number of clinical trials. So in other words, is the likelihood of a positive decision influenced by the volume of evidence available? Now, the findings from my next slide are from one of the multivariate regressions. Now, multivariate regression is a useful technique as it allows us to examine the association of one explanatory variable on the likelihood of coverage when controlling for other explanatory variables. So, for instance, we can evaluate whether, when holding the quality of the supporting evidence constant, if recent decisions are more or less likely to be favourable than older decisions. Okay, so I hope that all makes sense so far. Okay, so what do we find? Okay, so just to reiterate, we sought to determine what factors are associated with Medicare coverage and whether Medicare has become increasingly restrictive over time. And these are multivariate findings, so we're concurrently controlling for other explanatory variables in the analysis. So interventions, we found that interventions supported by RCTs with favourable findings was 7 times more likely to be covered than interventions not supported by RCTs with favourable findings. So that's encouraging, I think, if everybody would agree in the room. Similarly, interventions supported by non-randomized controlled trials or other clinical studies with favourable findings were 3 times more likely to be covered than interventions not supported by non-randomized controlled trials with favourable findings. So RCTs appear to be more predictive of coverage than non-RCTs, which again, I think, makes a lot of sense. Interventions supported by clinical guidelines with favourable recommendations were 5 times more likely to be covered than interventions not supported by clinical guidelines with favourable recommendations. Okay, so the clinical opinion does matter as well. We included a variable to account for whether alternatives were available to the intervention under review. We found that compared to when no therapeutic alternatives were available, those interventions for which an alternative was available were 7 times less likely to be covered. So if there's an alternative to the intervention under review, it's less likely to be covered. Okay, now an important aspect of this study was to examine whether when controlling for the quality of the supporting evidence, has CMS coverage in NCDs become more or less restrictive over time? Now we found that when compared to decisions made in the early years of our data set, so broadly 1999 through 2002, those made in the most recent years, so probably 2008 through 2012, were 20 times less likely to be covered. So in other words, when holding the quality of the supporting evidence constant, decisions made in the most recent years were many times less likely to be positive than decisions made in earlier years. So just to repeat that, when holding the quality of the supporting evidence constant, decisions made in the most recent years were many times less likely to be positive than decisions made in earlier years. And this finding stood up with the sensitivity analyses which we report in the study. So what do these findings mean? Well, first, encouragingly, we found that the quality and the volume of the supporting evidence appears to be predictive of Medicare coverage. So in other words, the more evidence we have and the better evidence we have, the more likely Medicare are to cover the technology. However, we also found that CMS appear to be scrutinizing the evidence base increasingly closely, and that when controlling for the quality of supporting evidence, coverage of medical interventions in CMS NCDs has become increasingly restrictive. And lastly, these findings have a number of important implications. They have implications for patients in terms of access to technology, and also have implications for industry as they put together clinical development programs and bring products to market. So thank you very much.
Good morning, and very pleased to be here, and also just want to thank the editors for continuing on this path of bringing together the two sides of healthcare. There's the one side, the R&D, product development, research, NIH, FDA world. The other side, the service sector of the insurance, delivery, prescription, patient engagement, all that often pass in the night and don't connect, and this is a great opportunity to bring them together. What I want to talk about with you, and the paper I talked about, is I guess I was just listening to the comments earlier today, the presentations earlier today, and a lot of the sort of the theme was that America has a unsophisticated buy side of the healthcare market, and I just finished a book on that topic, and I agree with that, but I actually think it's changing. I'm a little less pessimistic than I think some of the comments that I've heard, or at least my interpretation of. So I want to just talk very briefly about that. That's the paper I contribute to this paper, to this issue. Now, the usual economist line on the relationship between technology and costs is that technology and technological innovation is the long-term driver of healthcare cost inflation. Why have healthcare costs increased faster than the rest of the economy year after year, decade after decade, since the origin of any data on the topic? And the only possible 50, 60, 70-year explanation for that can be new drugs, new devices, new procedures, et cetera. But it also, the causality goes the other direction. Innovation is a response to spending in healthcare. Prices and profits, exorbitant prices and excess profits fuel R&D, draws capital into the sector and pushes it forward. And as we willy-nilly seem to be getting into an era where, for good reasons and for bad reasons, the rate of growth in spending is slowing down. That will have effect over time on the R&D machine. And the easiest thing to predict is a negative outcome, that the less profit's going to be less investment is going to be fewer new gizmos, all right? And that's just the way it's going to be. On the other hand, and my belief is that more sophisticated purchasing can actually improve the quality of the innovation, at least in some types, by having a more sophisticated buyer. Basically, America gets the biomedical innovation it deserves. If we're stupid, we get stupid, we deserve stupid. All right, that's just all there is to it. So this is the way my brain works. Between the lab and the patient, a new drug or device or procedure needs to go through basically 4 stages of assessment. It's got to get onto the market, FDA and EMA, et cetera, all of that. It's got to be covered. This is where the CMS and the insurers come in. The physicians have to prescribe it. The hospitals have to adopt it if it's an implantable or if it's a piece of radiology. And then the patient has to engage and adhere and be willing to take it. Each one of these are moments where the value of this new innovation is assessed in different ways and where a purchasing decision of some kind is being made. And I think that looking out there, that each one of these, the bar is rising for the industry. We just heard an excellent paper there on how CMS, which, you know, it's been easy to take pot shots at CMS, is being rolled by the industry decade after decade. But actually they're tightening up. The world that I live in, which is more the world of the self-insured employers and the major insurers and the hospital system, they, you know, don't want to say anything good about that whole sector. They don't need to, but basically they're getting better at this stuff, okay? They're using more, they've got the evidence from ECRI, from other sources. They're developing better payment mechanisms. It's slower than some of us would like. It's more confusing, et cetera. And then God bless the patients. They are being dragged against their will into becoming consumers, all right? And the biggest thing going on out there right now is the rise in consumer cost sharing. That is huge out there. Doesn't matter whether you are in the employment sector, employed health insurance sector, where high deductible and reference pricing is the name of the game, or you're getting it through the individual market, through the health insurance exchange changes. 90% of people getting health insurance through the health insurance exchanges are choosing high deductible. 90% are in silver and bronze. Those are 2,000 plus on the deductible. The brokers out there try to develop what they call copper level designs, even higher than a $5,000 deductible that'll go through these exchanges. And let me tell you, the consumer is the cheapest date in healthcare, you know? When they're spending their own money, they don't want, you know, they don't want the gizmo that's bright and shiny. Okay, so the three implications of that, what's that for the industry, okay? And remember, biomedicine, life science is one of the best industries the United States has. It's the one thing that we can sell to China. We want to buy everything from China. What does China want to buy from us? This is the stuff, okay? So we need to protect this. Now, three issues. First of all, on the design side, many biomedical devices, particularly you can see it in the device and diagnostics, are over-engineered. They have been designed to be add all this to maximum functionality without regard to cost. And so we are all driving, or all in medical care, we're all driving high-end, top-of-the-line cars. We've all got a Tesla. But they face entrance from, particularly from emerging economies which are moving up the value chain from manufacturing into design. And a lot of these are coming, they're so-called good enough technologies. They do the trick, but they come in at a much lower chassis. They come from India, from Singapore, from Israel, from China, from South Korea. This stuff is coming. And the incumbent firms simply need to take this into consideration and in the product design, look for what do patients really value and are willing to pay for, because they'll be paying more. And ditto, the hospital systems, the value assessment committees, the doctors, when they're on these, I can give you Avastin and Lucentis stories about how doctors actually respond to that. You give them the right incentive, you give the patient, the people respond to incentives. They respond to incentives. Secondly, pricing based on performance. I think that America is willing to continue paying premium prices for premium performance. I don't see anything changing in the culture out there which says there's any social tolerance for restricting access to breakthrough technologies, and we will often err on the side of, if we don't know whether this is a breakthrough or not, we'll consider it a breakthrough. Boom. And we'll pay for it, and that's just different about the United States of America from a lot of other places. I see no change in that whatsoever, none whatsoever. But there is going to be a demand for greater evidence. The evidence bar is rising, there's no question about that. For comparative effectiveness is day is coming, and cost effectiveness. And you know, cost effectiveness is rationing, and it's horrible for patients, and nobody believes in it, except for all the companies routinely provide this data to every other country in the world. They all have cost effectiveness data for Germany and England, et cetera. They all now have to give it to the hospital value committees, et cetera. It's coming. It's coming. I really do think that the industry has won every battle against cost effective analysis and has lost the war. You know, I really do think that that's what's going on. For incremental innovation, I think that the reality is that the industry is going to have to do parity pricing, and there's just no question about it, and there's more drive towards that, and it happens more rapidly. I think the notion that the industry is gouging, at least even on the pharmaceutical side, I mean, let's look at Hep C drugs. I mean, that's the budget buster of the moment, where they were being gouged, $1,000 a pill, $84,000. How many patients? 84,000 times 3 million. What's the number? We're all going broke, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And oh my God, has price competition broken out in the Hep C market? I mean, I teach this stuff. What's the number? What is the discount that Express Scripts got? How does it compare to the discount that the French Social Security system got? Well, the numbers are out there. They're in the double digits. They're way up in the double digits. Obviously, the Medicaid managed care plan started at 23% mandated discount, and they go from there. They drop one. It's going to be probably north of 40%, okay, discounts right off the top, and we're just getting going on Hep C. That's even aside from the utilization management controls on this. So, God bless Gilead. They don't support my research, unfortunately, and they're making a killing on this thing, which is really wonderful for them. But we do have a competitive market out there. CMS is tougher. The insurers are tougher. The doctors and hospitals are tougher. The patients are paying out of their own pocket. It's getting tougher out there for the industry. Finally, product distribution and service. Traditionally, how distribution was done was by individual physician detailing. Often for devices that happen in the operating room, and otherwise it was on the golf course. That's the way things just were done. I've been to spine surgery meetings in Cabo San Lucas, baby. You know what I mean? That was, I give talks and it's kind of like, whoa, let's go out and do the cigar tasting now. I mean, I don't know, whatever. But that's really changing. It's changing really fast. As hospitals and physicians align, it's really getting more valued, and it's raising the bar for the companies to be able to demonstrate value at that level and to the patient, and it's generally a good thing. It's painful, but it's generally a good thing for the industry. Reality is more sophisticated buyers create more sophisticated sellers. So I want to wrap up on that. The editors were nice enough to put the brochure to my book, which goes into this and provides all the evidence for this. It's coming out next month. But generally, thank you very much.
Good morning, and thanks for inviting me here to talk about the topic of hospital payment adjustments for innovations. And James Chambers talked about coverage. I'll talk about the payment side of things. And I did want to acknowledge my research collaborators on this project, Professor Robinson and also Susanna Mahaz from Abbott. Okay, so Congress and CMS, it's been almost 15 years since they recognized and took pioneering steps to establish special new technology payment mechanisms in the hospital prospective payment systems. And this addressed a problem that had long been raised by policy experts, where hospitals were facing significant challenges for some biomedical innovations in adopting them in the first few years after they became approved, because the hospital payment systems had not yet caught up to account for the cost of those innovations. And what we saw is prior research has shown that many other countries have followed in Medicare's footsteps by creating special new technology payment mechanisms in their own hospital prospective payment systems. And as no prior studies had looked at this issue since the adoption of U.S. healthcare reforms or the creation of these new technology mechanisms in other countries, we wanted to see what the experience has been. So what did we do? First, we worked with local experts in each country. We chose the US, Germany, France, and Japan because they represent the top 4 hospital payment systems in the world, and we limited our analysis to the hospital inpatient setting because this is where the majority of new technologies are first introduced. We also conducted a Medicare claims analysis since the inception of the Medicare inpatient program, and thanks to Eric Hamelman at Avalier who helped us with this. So first of all, in terms of the design, what did we find? And someone earlier today talked about innovation as being better and cheaper. And indeed, what we found is that in all 4
countries, there were similarities in terms that, first of all 4 countries had established special new technology payment mechanisms in their hospital prospective payment systems and conducted a formal evaluation to require that technologies met a newness criteria that required that it be sufficiently novel that it merited special recognition. And secondly, that there was broad consensus that it was required to show a substantial clinical improvement, formally in 3 of 4 countries, and in the 4th, the evaluation of clinical benefits factored heavily into the decision about whether the technology was sufficiently novel to be considered as a new technology. In contrast, we found 3 clear areas of difference between the Medicare program and other countries. First of all, with the payment mechanism, what we found was that Medicare was alone in requiring hospitals to share in the financial burden of adopting new technologies. The current payment formula in the inpatient setting currently limits new technology payments to 15% of incremental hospital costs or 50% of device costs, whichever is lower. And incidentally, this is quite different than the hospital outpatient setting where Medicare new technology payment programs do cover full incremental costs. And this was much different from the other countries. We also found that the payment duration was shorter and that the cost threshold that needed to be exceeded in order for technologies to qualify was significantly higher in the US. And this effectively limited the number of eligible technologies. And so in terms of looking at the number of new technology payment approvals, you'll see the Medicare in the blue line bumping along the bottom there on the graph. And what we saw was that the number of new technology approvals in the US Medicare program was much lower than the other countries, with an average of 1.4 approvals per year compared to 26, 83, and 44 per year in Germany, France, and Japan, respectively. In looking at the actual expenditures associated with the program, we looked at the Medicare claims data from fiscal years 2002 through 2013 and compared them both to CMS projections of expenditures when they approved the new technologies and to CBO projections that were issued for a 10-year period early in the program's inception. So what we found was that total spending was approximately $200 million, which was only 35% of what CMS had projected and more than 60% less than the CBO projections, and this was over a 12-year period. In addition, we looked at the actual expenditures compared to hospital costs. We found that hospitals that had graduated through the new technology program lost money in 10 of 10 technologies. And in 4 of 10 technologies, the financial losses were substantial enough that the new technology payments were actually exceeded by hospital outlier payments. And hospital outlier payments are a stop-loss insurance mechanism under the Medicare program to prevent hospitals from experiencing significant financial losses for unusually expensive cases. So what these findings suggested to us is that there's undoubtedly an important role for new technology payment mechanisms in hospital inpatient prospective payment systems, yet the experience to date indicates that the program is currently not meeting the expectations that Congress set when they established the program. And as the country moves towards value-based payment mechanisms, we suggest that it may be time to consider revising the payment mechanism in the inpatient setting so that providers aren't forced to experience financial losses when adopting beneficial innovations. And this will provide consistency to the existing new technology payment mechanisms that exist in the outpatient setting. And we also suggest that CMS retrospectively adjust value-based payment targets, such as in accountable care organizations, to account for hospital new technology payments so that hospitals are not required to experience financial losses when they adopt technologies that improve quality and outcomes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I believe I'm all that's standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to make it brief and somewhat interesting. I'd very much like to thank Health Affairs for inviting me to submit a paper in this issue and for including me in this gathering. We've been talking about innovation since about 9 o'clock this morning. In my former industry, for 30 years, I've been a practicing venture capitalist. I've been the person translating those discoveries and innovations that were realized as a result of all of the NIH-funded research and turning them into companies which turn them into products which then could be taken by larger companies and brought to market. And at least from my perspective, that's a perspective that is lacking. Let me give you an example out of our own files. So earlier today, we've had several conversations about TAVR, the transaortic valve replacement, and the importance that that has for cardiac patients. So in the files of my firm, I actually have the napkin. It's a napkin from the Midtown Manhattan Four Seasons bar that Dr. Martin Leon actually sat down with a partner of mine and drew out what is today the Sapien heart valve for Edwards. And it was the venture capital firm that figured out that this was something worth financing. It was the venture capital firm which went and hired the initial proof of concept studies. The venture capital firm that filed the patent. It was the venture capital firm that hired Dr. Stan Rowe as the leader of that project, today the head of R&D for advanced projects at Edwards. And it was the venture capital firm that established the R&D center in Israel that developed that initial product, in which all other products have subsequently been developed. So without the willingness of that early stage seed venture capital investment on the part of two venture firms, in fact, I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that that innovation wouldn't be here, but it would have come much later and undoubtedly in a different format. So this can be schematically represented in a slide that I use when I teach up at the business school at MIT, and it really shows you what happens when something goes from an idea or a discovery all the way to an approved product. And in fact, we've had reference to Joe DeMassi's work earlier today about the cost and various ways of calculating that cost of developing a product all the way from idea to the approval by the FDA. But in fact, different people put up that money at different times. So at the beginning, and from where you're looking at the left-hand version of that slide, the little tiny dollars, those are put up by little venture capital firms who are typically interacting with the academic scientists or the physicians and taking their ideas and turning them into companies and ideas. Again, I would remind you that in our discussions of hepatitis C, Gilead was a venture capital created company originally to develop products for HIV. It purchased the product known as Sovaldi from another venture capital created company called Pharmaceuticals for $11 billion midway through this development chart. So they had to spend $11 billion even before they got to the end. So the next set of little green dollar stickers that you see there, when something gets into the clinical trial phase, maybe that's when you're going to start seeing the pharmaceutical company really spending real money on clinical trials, particularly the more advanced clinical trials. And there are hundreds of transactions every year between small venture capital-backed companies and larger pharmaceutical and medical device companies. So in fact, that TAVR invention that I spoke of was sold after 7 patients to Edwards, which then spent the rest of the money to take it to market. And it was a good thing that we did, because it was approved in Germany in 2006 and not approved in the United States until almost 6 years later. And the cost and the risk and the uncertainty of taking that market from Germany, was doing very well, all the way into the United States was beyond the scope of any small venture capital backed or even publicly backed company. And then once you see companies move further and further down this chart, where there is more and more clarity about both the clinical risk of the product, the reimbursement or the likelihood that the product would be approved by the FDA and receive a favorable reimbursement. As that becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, investors, whether in the public markets or larger medical device or pharmaceutical companies, will in fact be willing to spend the money to acquire that innovation. In our discussion about precision medicine and referencing the president's proposal, he would like to spend more money on research. But I have to tell you that the process from a venture capitalist standpoint of taking new discoveries on the diagnostic side and going through this process and getting them approved by the FDA and then getting paid for them is a complete non-incentive to develop those products. So we can talk about the companies on this end, we can talk about the money going into the public side on this end, but until you fix the part in the middle, you're not going to get the bang on the buck that you're looking for. So this is evidenced by some data that I went looking at. There are two sources of data that monitor investments by venture capital firms. This one is put together by PricewaterhouseCoopers. It receives reports from all formal venture capital firms in the country, also outside the country now, and it grades them by the industry that they invest in, and it also talks about the stage at which they invest. So they categorize things in seed, early, later stage, or expansion stage, and I wanted to focus very much on the seed stage. That is when venture firms like mine actually go in and establish a new company based on a discovery. So as you can see, in the years of 2008 and 2009, when we were actually in the middle of a recession, and there were a lot of really scary things going on, although the numbers, and these numbers are by quarter, so there is some bumpiness because some quarters will have, because of a big deal, higher numbers than others. But you can generally see the average for 2008 and 2009 was pretty robust in biotech. And actually, although it was really up and down, it looked, had a couple of really good quarters in medical devices. But really starting in 2010, those numbers have fallen off a cliff. And despite the fact that overall venture capital, in money going to venture capital firms and investments by venture capitalists have reached 2008, 2009 levels for the industry, the amount going to biotechnology and to medical devices as a percentage of that total has fallen and continues to fall, and especially the amount going to the startups, the seed-level investments that start the new companies based on all that NIH research you're paying for has continued to drop. I think I talked about this in my opening remarks, but I would just say again, it is not enough to simply have the discoveries occur in the medical schools or in our fine research institutions. What's really important is to take those discoveries and have someone try to figure out, well, what product are we going to develop? Let's suppose that you were presented with the brand new CRISPR technology from George Church, or as I was, the RNAi inventions by Dr. Craig Mello, who won the Nobel Prize. So which product are you going to develop with that, and why? Which area, which patients are you going to pick out to spend incredibly risky money? Because I would remind you that at the beginning, when we're at the very yellow on the left, the chances of success are extremely low. You heard it earlier that a compound that hits the beginning of clinical trials has a 1 in 8 chance of success. So what do you think that makes my chances of success when I'm at the very beginning? It's like 1 in 20 or something like that, but it's not a very high likelihood of success. So the venture capital firm is often the one trying to figure out how a new innovation should be applied first. What areas should we take it into? Which patient pools should we go after? Who should lead that enterprise? How should we file the patents? Where should we locate the company? How much money should we put in to do all of that? So that's what, let's see if I can, lost my, did you turn me off?
Thank you very much.
That's probably the end of this talk. So the interest of time, no, but the point that I really wanted to make is those choices that are made by the venture capital firms are profoundly influenced by uncertainty. So when you're sitting at the beginning of the process and you are looking forward and you are trying to decide which areas you're going to go in, areas of policy, and I'll give you an example, rare and orphan diseases, where the regulatory process is extremely straightforward and fixed. You pretty much know what you have to do to get approval there. That's an attractive area for people because it's not moving around a lot. In 2009, 2010, a lot of policy started to change both on the delivery side through the ACA. There are also profound changes occurring in how we decided to pay for things and also how we decided to approve for things. For people who are starting at the very beginning, all that uncertainty is really scary. So what do? You pick areas that you think, this area the FDA has already had a change and made it very clear how products get approved. And that's why you're going to continue to see rare and orphan diseases receive a very high percentage of venture capital dollars relative to the number of patients that they're actually taking care of. You're also going to look for areas where we think the reimbursement is more certain. Again, rare and orphan diseases, really attractive, as is oncology, versus other areas where not so clear. Medical devices have been especially unclear and especially non-favored by payers, and as a result, venture capitalists have run away from investing in medical devices in droves. So finally, just the policy recommendations to wind up would simply be that we need to focus on ways of making the areas that we as a country want to prioritize, perhaps through the Faster Cures initiative, a little bit clearer to the people who are providing the early stage funding, which means a clear regulatory path, a clear reimbursement path, and perhaps some incentives in the earlier stages to help pay for the studies that would provide the data that make them clearer. Thank you very much.
I feel like we, in this last panel, got all these different sides of the financial ecosystem, from the money up front, which is affected by what's on the back end, the approval process, the supplement process. What I really want to do, rather than go paper by paper, Jamie, you were the optimist, partially from the purchasing side. I'd be interested if others share the optimism on that evolution, or if there are any sort of reactions to each other that refine your own thinking about the part of the ecosystem you focused on. And James, I don't know if you want to kick us off on.
Well, I mean, I think what my research shows is that evidence does matter, and one of the things I hope that my research changes or influences is that, we have a better understanding of what evidence is required, or how should we illustrate that patient health outcomes are actually improved, and that will positively affect coverage. And I think that mindset will help design better clinical trials. It also, I hope, will influence what products we pursue, because the likelihood of reimbursement is higher. And if we maintain that set of incentives, that we really are trying to generate products that do improve health outcomes, and the evidence is there to support that, and I think we're all shooting in the same direction. So I guess a little bit optimistic there.
Good.
Yeah, so I guess I would second the note of optimism. I think that clearly the entire environment in innovation is recognizing the importance to demonstrate value, and particularly the larger companies that eventually acquire these venture-backed companies and commercialize the technologies they are all multinational companies, and they are all focused on and working in many environments outside the United States that are very focused on requiring proof of value. And as you saw in some of the presentations on the coverage side, on the payment side, there are requirements to demonstrate value, yet in the health policy environment, when you look at specific types of technologies, the incentives and the requirements tend to be very lumpy. And so I think that now is time to relook at those set of incentives in the wake of having passed healthcare reform in the United States, and see whether they are serving us in the way that we need, and whether we need to tweak them or change them to get the types of innovation that we want and that we can afford.
So I'm also an optimist. You have to be an optimist to be a venture capitalist. It's really impossible to be otherwise. And as was evidenced, the hepatitis C problem looks like that's on the way to taking care of itself. The people who do make the investments at the very early stages are incredibly conscious of the need and the difficulty to build in to the design of your product, and both considerations of cost, considerations of demonstrating value. And it's really hard to do when you're sitting there right at the beginning trying to make it up on the very first day, and you tend then to go into areas that are these niche products, that are these rare and orphan diseases, because you can just have a better job of trying to figure out what the road is in front of you. So there is there are a couple of icebergs out in front. If you add up the cost of all these niche products, it doesn't look like it's very sustainable. So we do have to think about how to really determine what is a quality year for someone who's got one of these rare diseases, and how much we think it's worth to pay for. And we do have a huge iceberg looming on the horizon. Sooner or later, somebody will come up with a therapy that does modify the course of Alzheimer's, and when they do, they'll want to charge a lot of money for it. And we have a patient pool that's much larger than hepatitis C. And so we have a few years to figure that out as a society, and we need to all work together to do that.
Well, I launched the optimism wave up here because I thought the earlier discussion was a little pessimistic, so I will now switch sides and temper that a little bit. To have a good functioning biomedical innovation and payment system, you need both better information and better incentives. I think the information base is improving in a lot of different ways, more slowly than we would like, but it's getting better. And I think it's getting better in all different ways. That's good. The incentive structure is a little bit more iffy. And it's great that CMS is doing better, and you can see some positives. But I really think that the American system, as you look at it, the question is, where's the no in healthcare? Who says no? Where does it happen? And it's being pushed from the FDA through the insurers. It's landing more on the providers, and by which I mean these new payment mechanisms, and then onto the consumer through cost sharing. And the quality, the incentive structure there, and the quality of the information is very peculiar. Patients, what they consider as value is very idiosyncratic. They are making a lot more of the decisions. That is driving the investments a lot. I know that at least where I come from, out in the Silicon Valley, where's the venture capital going? If it's not going into medical devices, and if it's not going into drugs, where's it going? It's going into digital therapeutics, which I call pretty much an evidence-free zone. Okay, anything that uses an iPhone, we'll pay for. That's really that's kind of like the model. And hopefully some of these things will revolutionize, and most of them will not. So I do think that it's a never-ending task to improve the incentive structures, the payment structures, and in particular in the coming era, how the consumer is educated, incentivized, paying out of pocket, what's going on, and how do we design insurance benefit design to weed out the chaff and hold on to the wheat in the life sciences industry.
I think, given that we've pulled these together and we're pretty close to the end of time, rather than scatter additional questions out, I feel like that brings together a lot of the themes that have come over the course of the day. So I want to remind all of you that the issue that we released this week would not have been possible without support from the Biotechnology Industry Organization, the National Pharmaceutical Council, Pharma, AdvaMed, and Pfizer. We appreciate their support. I appreciate your attention today, and I would ask you to join me in thanking our final set of speakers.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, we'll work on that.